The sound wasn't just a sound, it was a physical blow, a concussive wave that struck the very marrow of my bones. It rattled the fillings in my teeth, vibrated the worn leather of my jacket, and turned the air around me into a living, howling thing. The tent, half collapsed, writhed like a dying animal, its synthetic skin snapping in a wind that wasn't there. My hands, numb with a fear that tasted like old copper and ozone, fumbled with the last tent pole. My eyes fixed on the distant lake, where the thing that made the noise was, or had been, churning the ancient waters, sending echoes of pure, primordial terror bouncing off the unforgiving rock faces. This was it. This was the moment I finally broke, or at least, the moment I finally accepted that breaking was just another Tuesday. But of course, it hadn't started with the world coming apart at the seams. It never did. It always began subtly, a ripple in the calm, an off-key note in the mundane symphony of existence. This time, it began with a yearning for silence and a road that twisted deeper into a forgotten corner of the world, leading me straight into the maw of something I couldn't comprehend, yet instantly recognized. The road to Whispering Pines Lake was less a road and more suggestion, a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt unspooling through a forest that seemed to actively resent its intrusion. I'd seen plenty of trees in my time, more than any man should, driving the late shifts, chasing the next paycheck and the next anonymous town. But this forest, this was different. Not just dense, but impenetrable. The kind of density that swallowed sunlight and sound, that made you feel like you were venturing into a maw rather than just driving through a state park. Pine needles, thick as a carpet, muffled the last whispers of the outside world, and the air itself seemed thicker, older, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something indefinable, something ancient. My beat-up pickup, reliable but weary, ate up the miles, its engine a low thrum against the oppressive quiet. I kept my hand on the steering wheel, my thumb tracing the worn leather, and occasionally, without thinking, my other hand would drift to my left wrist, my fingers finding the cool, smooth glass of my old analog watch. Not to check the time, I rarely cared what time it was anymore, but just for the tactile reassurance of its familiar weight, a small, mechanical certainty in a life that offered none. I was on the run again, not from any specific person, but from the cumulative weight of everything I'd seen, everything that followed me like a persistent shadow, a few weeks slinging boxes in a warehouse, a few more guarding a vacant lot, and the walls had started to feel too thin, the shadows too long. So, I packed my 2 duffels, one with clothes, the other, the go bag, always ready with cash, a heavy mag light, and a first aid kit, and pointed the truck north. Whispering Pines Lake promised solitude, cheap camping, and a place where the noise in my head might finally, mercifully, quiet down for a few days. Fool's hope. I knew. It always was. The campsite itself was what you'd expect. A cleared patch of dirt, a fire ring, and a picnic table scarred with decades of initials and clumsy declarations of love. It felt small, almost insignificant, swallowed whole by the towering evergreens that stood like silent, disapproving sentinels. I didn't bother with a fire ring, just enough space for my 2-man tent, a place to pull my sleeping bag, and a few hours of uneasy sleep. The air, even in the early afternoon, carried a chill that bit sharper than it should have, seeping into the marrow, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. I shivered, tugging my worn leather jacket tighter around me. "Great, Leo," I muttered, my voice rough from disuse. "Another 5-star resort. Hope they have room service for the existential dread." After wrestling the tent into a semblance of structure, a task that always felt absurdly domestic given the nature of my life, I decided to scout the lake. The idea was to find a quiet spot, maybe try to fish. Not that I was much of a fisherman, but it was an activity that required quiet, stillness, and an illusion of normalcy. Anything to drown out the internal monologue for a few hours. The truck rumbled to life, the sound comforting in its mechanical predictability compared to the unsettling silence of the forest. The lake access point was a short drive, down a winding dirt road that quickly narrowed, the trees pressing in, their branches scratching against the truck's sides like skeletal fingers. When I finally reached the small, gravel parking area, a low sense of unease, a familiar hum beneath my skin, started to prickle. The lot was empty. Not surprising for a weekday, I reasoned, but the emptiness here felt different, too empty. Like the world had collectively decided to avoid this particular patch of wilderness. A narrow path, choked with pine needles and loose rocks, led down to the shoreline. The lake itself spread out before me, a vast, dark mirror reflecting the bruised sky. It was shaped like a massive bowl, rimmed by steep, forested hills that rose sharply into jagged, snow-dusted peaks. Beautiful. Yes, in a stark, unforgiving way. But the beauty felt hungry, like something was always waiting just beyond the tree line. My hand went to my watch again, my thumb pressing down on the crown. My go bag was still in the truck, but the mag light was in my jacket pocket, a familiar, comforting weight. Always be prepared to run. I walked to a small ledge, a natural outcropping of rock just off the main trail. It was secluded, offering a good view of the lake's expanse. I unfolded my battered camping chair, the cheap plastic groaning in protest, and set about rigging a fishing rod that had seen better days. The quiet was absolute, broken only by the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant, almost imperceptible hum of insects. It was the kind of quiet that pressed in on you, that felt too heavy, too complete, like the world was holding its breath. I kept glancing up, scanning the opposite shore, the tree line, an instinct born of too many nights spent looking over my shoulder. Years of running had honed my senses to a knife's edge. I noticed the way the light fell through the canopy in a specific, almost artificial way, the subtle shift in the air temperature that had nothing to do with the sun dipping lower. The sun, a bruised orange orb, began its slow descent, painting the western peaks in shades of deep violet and blood red. I watched it, my mind drifting, trying to empty itself of the usual parade of horrors and anxieties. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was just the hum of the reel, the quiet pull of the line, and the vast, indifferent beauty of the lake. Then it came, a sound. Not a sound, exactly. A presence. A long, drawn-out, booming moan ripped through the silence, echoing across the vast expanse of the lake. It was sudden, brutal. One moment, absolute stillness. The next, the very air vibrated with a sound so deep, so profound, it seemed to originate from the deepest strata of the earth itself. It lasted for what felt like an eternity, perhaps 5 or 6 seconds, before abruptly, horrifyingly, cutting off. The silence that followed was even worse, pregnant with the aftershocks of that terrible noise. The moan bounced back and forth, a disembodied wail ricocheting off the bowl of hills, lasting a good 2 seconds longer than the original sound had. My eardrums throbbed, a dull ache settling deep within my skull. The world seemed to tilt, my chair rocking slightly, though I knew it was only my perception. I froze, my hand still on the fishing reel, my breath caught in my throat. My heart, a veteran of countless panics, began to hammer against my ribs with a renewed, frantic rhythm. It was the sound of a wail in agony, magnified 1,000 times, pulled from the crushing depths and forced into the thin, indifferent air of the surface world. Only there were no whales here, not in this landlocked pocket of despair. Something immense, something utterly beyond human comprehension, had just compressed and released every cubic foot of air in this entire valley. The pressure was palpable, a physical weight on my chest. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice thin, reedy, utterly alien in the vast quiet. The question hung in the air, unanswered, mocked by the echo of the moan. I waited, straining my ears, subconsciously urging the sound to return, to offer some clue, some tangible form, so my mind could categorize it, dismiss it. But nothing came. Only the infuriating, oppressive silence. I tried to chuckle, a dry, rasping sound that died in my throat. Joking about it was an old habit, a defense mechanism, but it felt hollow here, a cheap suit of armor against something far too big. My heart, despite my attempts at cynical dismissal, was still doing a frantic tango against my sternum. My gaze swept the lake, then the tree line, searching, desperately searching for some explanation. A large animal, a landslide, some bizarre geological phenomenon. My brain, ever the diligent, desperate rationalizer, spun through possibilities, rejecting each one as inadequate. This wasn't a deer. This wasn't a falling rock. This was other. I decided with the cold, clear logic of a man who'd seen too much that it was time to pack it in. Fishing was overrated anyway. I reeled in my line, the monofilament whispering a fragile farewell to the dark water. As I started to dismantle the rod, carefully, methodically, trying to calm the tremor in my hands, a low, persistent hum began to vibrate through the ground. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears, not exactly. It was a resonance, a frequency that bypassed the auditory canal and went straight for the bone. The booming moan came again. This time, I was ready, or as ready as a man can be for the sound of the world ending. My tackle box, sitting open on the rock beside me, rattled violently. The assorted hooks, lures, and sinkers jumped, clattering against the plastic, a miniature earthquake in a box. It wasn't a gust of wind. The air was still, heavy. This was a concussive force, a vibration passing through the very earth beneath me, the very air I breathed. My head snapped up, my eyes scanning the opposite shore of the lake, already knowing what I would see, the tree line, impossibly far away, blurred. And then, for a split second, I saw it, or something, a flash of lighter color, something immense and indistinct, breaking through the dense canopy. It was too big for any known animal, too fluid for a rock slide. The trees around it swayed heavily, impossibly, or like giant reeds caught in a hurricane. Though no wind stirred the air around me, they bent and swayed, bowing to some unseen, colossal force, looking as if they might snap and fall into the water. But they didn't. They simply thrashed, then slowly, agonizingly slowly, settled back into their suffocating stillness, a silent testament to the monstrous thing that had just passed through them. Another booming moan. This one was closer, louder, deeper. It didn't just echo, it rippled. The surface of the lake, once a placid mirror, began to dance with small, short, concentric rings, as if a gigantic invisible hand had just pressed down on the water and then released it. It was like watching sand vibrate on a speaker plate, except the plate was the size of a lake, and the entire surface was disturbed. My teeth chattered, my vision blurred, and a blinding headache flared behind my eyes. The sound must have contained elements far below the human hearing range. A subsonic bass note that bypassed the ears and went straight for the guts. If it hadn't, if the full auditory assault had reached my ears, my eardrums would have burst, leaving me deaf, probably insane. My survival instincts, honed to a cruel perfection over years of running, took over. There was no discussion, no deliberation, just raw, animalistic flight. I didn't bother packing anything neatly. The fishing rod, the tackle box, the chair, everything was thrown haphazardly into a single, frantic pile. My mind screamed, "Get out! Now!" I stumbled back up the narrow path, my feet slipping on the loose gravel, my eyes still darting to the lake. expecting to see some colossal, tentacled horror rise from the depths. My heart was a frantic drum solo in my chest, a desperate, deafening rhythm that threatened to drown out all other thought. The truck, my old, dented sanctuary, loomed ahead. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so violently I almost dropped them. The driver's side door creaked open, a sound that grated on my hypersensitive nerves. As I threw my gear onto the passenger seat, another pair of headlights cut through the gloom, pulling into the gravel lot. Two men, both older than me, emerged from a newer, shinier pickup, their faces etched with the easygoing calm of weekend warriors. Fishermen, probably, for a brief, irrational moment, the sight of other people, normal people, brought a sliver of relief. Maybe I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe it was just something explainable, a bear, a trick of the light. My old brain, trying to cling to sanity, desperate for a mundane explanation. They caught my eye. Two easygoing nods. I nodded back, probably looking like a wide-eyed lunatic, my face pale, sweat beading on my forehead despite the chilling air. Then the boom sounded again. This time it was unmistakably closer, and the sound of it, if it was possible, felt even more physical. The truck I was leaning against vibrated violently, the windows rattling in their frames, the metal groaning. I could hear it now, distinctly, under the low-frequency moan, the sound of water churning, a vast, unseen engine grinding beneath the surface of the lake, straining under some immense, impossible pressure. I jumped, my head hitting the roof of the truck, but I barely registered the pain. The two fishermen who had just started pulling their gear from the back of their own truck froze, their faces, once easygoing, contorted into masks of pure, unadulterated terror. One of them dropped his cooler, a cascade of ice and soda bottles scattering across the gravel. Without a second thought, I scrambled into my cab, slammed the door, and twisted the key in the ignition. The engine coughed once, then roared to life, a blessed, deafening noise that momentarily drowned out the primordial wail. I slammed the shifter into reverse, backing out of the parking spot with a screech of tires on gravel, then slammed it into drive. As I fishtailed onto the narrow dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The two fishermen were already scrambling, stuffing their gear back into their truck with frantic, clumsy movements, their faces stark white in the dimming light. The moan, a lingering ghost, finally faded as I sped away, leaving them to their own personal horror show. My conscience, that damned, nagging part of me, pricked at me. Should I have warned them? Should I have waited? I pushed it down. No. Every second wasted was a second closer to whatever that was. And in my experience, the only thing that followed these sounds was trouble and death. The drive back to the main road, which had taken 10 minutes of cautious winding on the way in, now felt like an eternity. My fingers drummed a frantic, nervous rhythm on my thigh, a relentless beat against the thudding panic in my chest. I'd read about it years ago, in some dusty medical journal in a motel lobby. Infrasound, super low frequency sounds, below the threshold of human hearing, capable of inducing intense feelings of dread, panic, even terror, capable of making the very air around you feel wrong, heavy with an unseen presence. I was convinced, with a cold certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was what was happening to me. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks. It was a physical assault. My body was reacting to something that my ears couldn't fully process, but my primal instincts screamed a danger. I thought I heard another moan, a faint, rattling tremor that shook the windows of the truck, vibrated the steering wheel in my hands. But it was fleeting, a phantom limb of sound. It could have been the wind, or the rough road, or just the fear, twisting my perceptions. My grip on the wheel tightened, my knuckles white. My gaze flickered to the rearview mirror. then to the side mirrors, expecting to see some titanic, impossible shape looming in the fading light. But there was nothing, only the oppressive, silent trees. My campsite, a mere 10 minutes from the lake by the winding, speed-limited road, felt dangerously close now. Too close. I could still see a sliver of the lake's dark surface through the trees from my tent spot, a constant, nagging reminder of what lay waiting. As soon as the truck lurched to a halt, I knew there was no staying, no trying to sleep this off. My heart, still racing like a trapped bird, wouldn't stop. It was a unilateral decision made in the space of a single breath. Get out. Now. I killed the engine, plunging the small clearing into a sudden, terrifying silence. My hand immediately went to my watch, my thumb tracing the cold metal of the bezel, a desperate plea for normalcy. Then, moving with a speed born of pure, distilled fear, I unzipped the tent. The air inside was stale, oppressive. My sleeping bag, a faded olive-drab rectangle of synthetic comfort, was rolled and tossed into the truck bed in seconds. My sparse belongings followed. Just as I was wrestling with the aluminum poles, trying to collapse the tent's flimsy frame, it came again. A moan. Less intense, perhaps, than the ones I'd heard by the lake, but no less terrifying. This one was unequivocally from the lake, echoing up the mountainside, a mournful, agonizing bellow. The sound seemed to cling to the air, to the very fabric of the trees, rattling around the bowl of the valley for an impossibly long time. It didn't just echo, it reverberated, a wave of sonic dread that refused to dissipate. Usually, the dense forest would absorb and dampen such sounds, but this one seemed to feed on the very air, growing, twisting, until it slowly, agonizingly, wore itself out. If you were floating underwater, in the abyssal dark, and some titanic, impossibly sharp spear had been plunged into the side of a colossal whale, twisting in its flesh, the water would sound like what I heard, a primal boom as the water compacted, followed by a raw, desperate tinge of pain on the fringes, resulting in a higher, almost keening pitch. And if you were deep, near the black floor of the ocean, you'd hear it bounce back at you again, a shadow of the sound but still equally horrifying, a ghostly echo of agony. This was that sound, translated to the land, amplified to an impossible scale, and aimed directly at my soul. "No!" I rasped, my voice barely a whisper. "Not today. Not here." I grabbed the collapsed tent fabric, a pathetic heap of nylon and aluminum, and simply smashed the whole thing into the truck bed, not bothering to fold it, not bothering with buckles or straps. It was a single, desperate, chaotic act. Then I threw myself into the cab, slamming the door so hard the whole vehicle shuddered. The key was already in the ignition. The engine caught immediately, roaring to life, a cacophony of sound that felt like salvation. I didn't care about the speed limit, about anything but distance. I slammed the shifter into drive, the tires spitting gravel as the truck shot forward, leaving the haunted clearing behind. The engine was too loud to determine if the moan was still lingering, if the unseen thing was still bellowing its primordial rage into the night. But the sheer, bone-deep panic it had induced, the primal, unshakable certainty that something ancient and terrible had stirred in those dark waters, made me utterly unwilling to stick around and investigate. My cynical facade had cracked, revealing the raw, bleeding fear underneath. Looking back, now, from the dubious safety of another nameless motel room, with the drone of the highway a distant, meaningless hum, a part of me wishes I had stayed, a dark, so morbid curiosity, a side effect of all the horrors I've witnessed, tugs at me. To truly see it, to understand what kind of unimaginable leviathan could make the very mountains groan. But that's the trauma talking, the slow creep of madness. At the time, in that moment, with the sound of the world ending echoing in my bones, I was happy, happier than I'd been in years, because I was leaving, because I was still, somehow, alive. The only victory I ever truly sought. 995 characters. The world had a way of kicking you when you were down, then asking if you'd mind staying there so it could get a better angle. Tonight, the world wasn't just kicking, it was performing open-heart surgery with a rusty butter knife. Frankie's last breath hitched in her throat, a choked gasp of horror, as Jake, the bastard, plunged something into her skull with a sickening, wet thud. It was over before the sound registered, before my mind could truly process what my eyes had just seen. The sheer, brutal efficiency of it. My scream, a raw, ragged sound that tore from my own throat, was a beat too late, an empty echo in the sudden, profound silence. My feet were already moving, a primal, animalistic surge of terror propelling me forward. Run! That single, desperate command hammered in my skull, obliterating all thought, all reason. Just run. That's how it always ended, wasn't it? Running, always running. Tonight, though, the terror had a sharper edge, a colder, more personal sting than usual. It started hours earlier, somewhere north of the city limits, under a sky that looked like a bruised peach. I was behind the wheel of my rig, the familiar rumble of the diesel engine a low thrum beneath me, a constant, dull companion to the weariness that had settled deep in my bones. Another late-night haul, another anonymous stretch of highway. Just how I liked it. Keep moving. Don't get comfortable. Don't get seen. It was the only way I knew how to survive, though survival felt less like a victory and more like a prolonged, agonizing deferment of the inevitable. My old analog wristwatch, a relic I clung to like a drowning man to a plank, read a little past midnight when the light flickered across my rearview mirror. Not a deer, not an animal. Something off. I'd seen enough things off in my life to know the feeling. The prickle on the back of my neck, the subtle tightening in my gut. Instinct, honed by years of running from things that shouldn't exist, screaming at me to keep my foot on the gas and not look back. But my foot, damn it, eased off the pedal. Call it curiosity. Call it a fatal flaw. I called it a self-destructive itch I could never quite scratch. The headlights cut through the gloom, painting a tableau of violence on the gravel shoulder. A woman, small and thin, crumpled at the feet of a hulking man. He was a shadow, indistinct in the harsh glare, but his intent was crystal clear. Every swing of his fist was a punctuation mark on the air, each impact a sickening thump that reverberated even from the highway. My hand, without conscious thought, went to the crown of my watch, turning it uselessly. Don't get involved, Leo. The voice of cynicism, my oldest friend, whispered in my head. Just keep driving. You've seen worse. You've done worse. What good will you do? But another voice, a quieter, more insistent one that I'd learned to dread, pulled at me. It was the voice of the reluctant conscience, the one that hated letting things burn, the one that reminded me of things I'd rather forget, things I'd failed to stop. Sycamore Grove, the smell of smoke and fear, the faces I couldn't save. No, not again, not if I could help it. I pulled the rig to the shoulder, the air brakes hissing like an angry viper. The worn leather of my jacket felt heavy on my shoulders, a familiar weight that was both comfort and burden. A couple of quick checks, doors locked, go bag under the seat, knife within reach in the glove compartment. More for routine than any real belief it would make a difference. What good was a knife against a monster when the monster often wore a human face? I grabbed my heavy mag light, its beam a comforting, solid cylinder in the suffocating darkness, and stepped out. The chill hit me first, a sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and froze the blood in your veins, the kind that screamed, "Wrong." "Hey!" My voice was rougher than I intended, an attempt at authority that felt hollow even to my own ears. "What the hell is going on here?" The hulking man paused, his arm frozen mid-swing, silhouetted against the blinding glare of his own car's headlights. The woman below him whimpered, a small, pained sound that twisted something in my gut. He turned, and I could finally make out his features, a face hard and brutal, eyes like chips of flint. Jensen, I'd later learn, a name that would forever taste like bile. "None of your business, pal," Jensen snarled, his voice thick with menace. "Just keep driving." My grip tightened on the maglite. "Looks like my business when there's a woman getting beaten on the side of a public road." He took a step towards me, his bulk intimidating even from a distance. My eyes, ever scanning, caught something else then. Not a person, not an animal. A ripple, a distortion in the air, a shimmer of heat above the gravel. Even though the air was freezing, it was like looking at something through dirty, undulating water. And then, the feeling, a vast, ancient malevolence, like a hungry void, expanding in the space between Jensen and the woman. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird desperate to escape its cage. This wasn't just a domestic dispute anymore. This was other. The ripple solidified. It was cloaked, hooded, its form vaguely human. But I knew, with the chilling certainty of absolute terror, that it wasn't. It moved with an impossible glide, not walking, not floating, but simply being from one point to another. It wasn't striding, it was manifesting. A silent, terrifying promise of something profoundly wrong. The air crackled with an unseen energy, a faint scent of ozone like after a lightning strike, clinging to the damp night. The entity stopped beside the woman, who was still trying to scramble away from Jensen's boot. It seemed to lean over her, though there was no discernible head or body to lean. And then, a sound that wasn't a sound. A whisper that vibrated not in my ears, but in my very bones. A wish to be someone else. Anyone else. My vision blurred at the edges, a dizzying spiral of black and red, like blood in water. I felt a tug, a sensation of something being ripped, not from my body, but from the very fabric of the reality around me. It was the fleeting, horrific brush of two souls exchanging places. And for a terrifying, sickening second, I thought it was my soul being torn, my curse, my marked nature, vibrating in horrific sympathy with the raw, desperate magic unfolding before me. A fleeting, crimson shimmer, like a single droplet of pure fear, seemed to brush past me in the swirling chaos, moving in the opposite direction from the torrent. Was that her soul? Was it mine? I didn't know, and I didn't want to. My stomach lurched. The world righted itself with a jarring snap. Jensen, the hulking brute, suddenly shrieked, a high, reedy sound, entirely out of place coming from that mountain of a man. He stumbled back, lifting his boot from the woman, his face contorted in a mask of genuine, bewildered terror. The woman below him, now free, gasped for air, then slowly, agonizingly, pushed herself up, and that's when the true horror started. The man who had been Jensen now looked at his own massive, bruised hands with wide, terrified eyes. And the woman who had been Bethany now stood in Jensen's body, equally bewildered, a desperate moan tearing from her lips. My mind, usually so quick to find a sarcastic quip, struggled to process. They had swapped. The entity, having delivered its twisted miracle, had already dissipated, leaving nothing but the bone-deep cold and the lingering scent of something metallic and foul. "What the?" I started, but my voice died in my throat. The woman in Jensen's body spoke first, her voice raspy, alien in that heavy frame. "We have to call someone." Then the man in Bethany's body stammered, "Bethany, Is that you? What is happening? I watched them, a macabre dance of identity crisis unfolding under the truck's high beams. My cynical brain tried to find the angle, the con, the trick, but there was no trick. Just raw, unadulterated reality warped beyond recognition. This was a nightmare of the purest kind, a consequence of desperation and malevolent magic. I don't know, the woman in Jensen's body blubbered, backing away towards Jensen's car, a sleek, black sedan that looked out of place on this deserted road. Let's get out of the street. The man in Bethany's body, Jensen's mind trapped in Bethany's frail frame, pointed a trembling finger. You did this to me, didn't you? How? He started pounding Jensen's body, his own body, with Bethany's weak, shaking fists, the pathetic blows barely making a dent. It was horrifying. The lack of understanding on his face, the sheer, animalistic confusion that someone could do this to him, the man who had always been the one in control. It was sickening. But even more sickening was the moment Bethany and Jensen's body caught the small, weak fist. Not with violence, but with a strange, hesitant tenderness. A dawning realization on her face. Power. Not the kind that Jensen wielded like a weapon, but the kind that came from physical strength, from being able to defend oneself. And in that moment, I saw a flicker of something ancient in her eyes. A decision. Get in the car, he ordered, voice still rough but undeniably firm. To my surprise, Jensen in Bethany's body didn't protest. He looked at his shaking fists, the marks of abuse still fresh on her body, then back at the formidable frame of his former self. He complied. They clambered into the sedan, the woman in Jensen's body taking the driver's seat, and sped off into the night. I was left alone on the highway, the stench of ozone and damp earth hanging heavy in the air, a single drop of something dark and viscous glinting on the gravel where Bethany had lain. My heart was still hammering, but my mind, ever the cynic, was already cataloging. A wish, a cloaked figure, a body swap, and I was the only witness. Great, Leo. Just what you needed. Another reason to look over your shoulder every damn second. My hand went to my watch again, checking the time that didn't matter. Another tick on the cosmic score sheet of my fucked up life. Another horror added to the growing pile. I got back into my rig, the cab suddenly feeling too small, too vulnerable. The silence of the highway, usually a comfort, now felt like a predatory hush. I should have driven, should have just kept going. But the image of Bethany's eyes and Jensen's face, the flicker of agency, the desperation, it kept me rooted. My reluctant conscience, my curse, whatever you wanted to call it, had already decided for me. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, following the direction they had gone. The sedan wasn't hard to spot. Jensen, even in Bethany's body, wasn't a subtle man. I kept a safe distance, watching them weave through the bending country lanes. The woman in Jensen's body was driving with a fierce, almost desperate focus. Jensen in Bethany's body was hunched over, gripping the handle above the door, visibly struggling. My jaw ached. I could almost hear the internal monologue of the woman, the one now inhabiting Jensen's frame. Why am I trying to save him? She'd be thinking. I should have left him at the side of the road. It was a thought I was intimately familiar with myself, one I'd wrestled with after every time my conscience dragged me into trouble. The cold, logical part of my brain, the part that had kept me alive this long, screamed for self-preservation. But the other part, the part that still remembered the Sycamore Grove fire, the helpless screams, that part always won. Or more accurately, lost. They pulled into a driveway in front of a small, slightly ramshackle house. Frankie's house, I later pieced together. And that's when the situation escalated from bizarre to actively dangerous. A Ford Ranger, beat up and covered in derogatory bumper stickers, already sat in the driveway. Jake's truck, Jensen's friends. Of course, the world always found a way to make things worse. My stomach clenched. Jensen alone was a monster. Jensen with his pack, a whole different kind of terror. I parked my rig down the street, melting into the shadows. A silent, unwilling sentinel. The woman in Jensen's body hesitated, her posture stiffening, but Jensen in Bethany's body, that vile, entitled creature, already had the passenger door open, a horrific smile stretching Bethany's bruised lips. He chuckled, a sound that curdled my blood. "You wanted to talk to Frankie. Let's talk to Frankie." The absolute, unshakable arrogance of the man. Even when trapped in a body he despised, it was chilling. He pounded on the door. I saw the woman in Jensen's body turn to him, whispering something, probably begging for caution. But Jensen in Bethany's body just scoffed. "We're not going to explain anything. Do you want them to think we're crazy?" The sheer lack of self-awareness. It was almost laughable, if it wasn't so profoundly disturbing. The door opened a crack, revealing a scared-looking woman, Frankie. Her eyes went from Jensen in Bethany's body to the woman in Jensen's body, and then she gasped, whimpering, "Beth!" Her face contorted with disgust as she looked at the hulking figure of Jensen, now inhabited by her friend. Jensen in Bethany's body, still trying to play the part, said, "Nothing. He crashed the car." A lie, of course. A terrible, transparent lie. Frankie's eyes, wide with fear, went to the bruises on Bethany's face, then to the massive hands of Jensen in Bethany's body. She said, "You need to go to the hospital." The woman in Jensen's body tried to interject, to get Frankie to come with them, to get help, but Jensen in Bethany's body smoothly cut her off, his voice cloying and false in Bethany's throat. "I was being silly, honey. These are just cuts and bruises. They'll heal. You're so dramatic." The casual cruelty of it, spoken from the very lips of his victim, it made my skin crawl. Then the cavalry arrived. Jake, Matt, and Liam. 3 Neanderthals who walked like they owned the ground beneath them. Their expressions a mix of concern and barely concealed aggression. More monsters in human skin. My hand went to my watch again, my thumb rubbing the cool metal. This wasn't good. This wasn't good at all. Jensen in Bethany's body opened his mouth to greet his friends, then seemed to remember he was no longer himself. He watched wide-eyed as his cronies made a beeline for his, Jensen's body, now inhabited by Bethany. The irony would have been delicious if I wasn't so worried. The woman in Jensen's body struggled to mimic Jensen's voice, to sound like the man who had just beaten her. "Hey guys, listen, I know I said that we should do this, but I've changed my mind. Let's go home." Jake scoffed, eyeing Jensen's body. Bethany suspiciously. "What? No, we drove all the way here for you. Bethany needs an intervention, and you clearly aren't getting through to her. Sonny, that's why we're here, isn't it? We're not leaving until this has been sorted." Matt and Liam, 2 grunting automatons, echoed Jake's sentiment. My gut tightened. They were here to reinforce Jensen's control, to break Bethany completely. And now they were unwittingly doing it to their own friend, trapped in his victim's body, a grotesque puppet show, and I, the weary wanderer, was caught in the audience. The woman in Jensen's body wanted to ask if Frankie had been hurt, but she couldn't. It would break the illusion. And I knew, from the way Liam's eyes flickered to the battered face of Jensen in Bethany's body, that any deviation from the script would be met with violence. This was a powder keg, and the body swap had just thrown a match into it. Jensen in Bethany's body, however, seemed to relish the attention. "They're right, Jensen," he said, barely concealing his giddiness. "I've been acting insane. I need this. I've needed this for a long time." The words were Bethany's, the sentiment Jensen's. It was a sick echo. "Shut the up, Bitch, Jake growled, eyes narrowed at Jensen and Bethany's body. I wasn't talking to you, was I? The shift was instantaneous. Jensen and Bethany's body flushed, a mix of frustration, embarrassment, and a dawning fear painting Bethany's face. He wasn't used to being suppressed. He wasn't used to being threatened. The power dynamic, so crucial to his existence, had been flipped. Frankie, bless her, tried to intervene. Listen, I'm going to call the... Jake, a caricature of menace, mocked her. You're going to call the... You aren't going to call anyone. He rolled his eyes as Frankie's lip trembled. You're not going to cry again, are you? We only came here to talk. Frankie, we're here for Bethany, not you. Now, are we going to head inside or stand on this porch all night? Jensen and Bethany's body strolled into Frankie's house without hesitation, the epitome of arrogant male privilege, and the woman in Jensen's body followed, trying to offer Frankie a soft, apologetic smile. A smile that Frankie, seeing her friend's abuser's face, could only interpret as a cruel grin. This was a nightmare of miscommunication, a hell of mistaken identity. I felt a cold dread settle in my chest, a familiar friend. Inside, the living room felt claustrophobic. The air was thick with unspoken tension, the kind that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I watched from the shadows of the street, my senses stretched to their limit. Now, Bethany, do you know why we're here? Jake asked, his voice dripping with false concern. Jensen and Bethany's body replied, using a sweet tone that utterly betrayed Bethany's true feelings. Yes, I do. I've been horrendous. I know I said I wanted to run to Frankie, but he really made me see how stupid I was being. I'm just a coward sometimes, I suppose. Frankie, no offense, but we're not even friends anymore, and are we? It's all about Jensen and me now. That's my focus. We just need a little work. Matt, the idiot, nodded sagely. Relationships are hard, but you've got to trust Jensen. He's a good man. He's put up with a lot from you. You know, you're lucky to have him. Frankie scoffed, a tiny, defiant sound. Have you got something to say, bitch? Liam asked, his voice flat and dangerous. Leave it, Jake interrupted, eyes still fixed on Bethany and Jensen's body. We aren't here to fix her. We're here to help our buddy. The woman in Jensen's body, sensing the escalating tension, tried to intervene. Beth, let's go upstairs for a second and have a private word. Her heart, I could feel it, must have been pounding. She was trying to protect Jensen, even after everything. Her damned conscience, just like mine. Jensen in Bethany's body rolled his eyes. No, babe, we should stay here and listen to what the boys have to say. They're speaking sense. Is this what she's always like? Sonny? Jake gasped, turning to the woman in Jensen's body. You're a f***ing nightmare. Bethany, you don't respect him at all, do you? You don't want to work on this relationship? Go upstairs and talk to him. We'll be waiting down here. A moment of genuine shock flashed across Jensen and Bethany's body's face. Nobody had ever spoken to him like that. The humiliation was palpable, and the worst part was that he didn't understand why. But the woman in Jensen's body did. She knew these men. She knew the danger. My gut clenched in sympathy. I knew that fear. I felt it almost constantly, reluctantly. Jensen and Bethany's body nodded and followed the woman in Jensen's body upstairs. A brief reprieve. I allowed myself a single, ragged breath. Through the thin walls, I could hear their muffled voices. Jensen in Bethany's body, his voice small and whining, asking what the f was happening. The woman in Jensen's body, voice still rough, trying to explain the reality of the situation, the body swap, the entity. And then the chilling shift. Jensen in Bethany's body's dawning, horrifying realization. He saw it not as a curse, but as a lesson. a cosmic intervention designed to make Bethany, now in his own abused body, understand his perspective. His unshakable narcissism, his inability to comprehend true empathy, was breathtaking in its monstrosity. He truly believed he was the victim, and this was all for her benefit. "That doesn't sound right, Jensen," the woman in Jensen's body said, her voice laced with dread, but he was already going back downstairs. "Let's finish this," he announced, his voice sickeningly cheerful in Bethany's ruined throat. "We'll sort everything out, then we'll end up back in our bodies. And you'll never be an ungrateful little bitch ever again. You'll finally appreciate what you have." My blood ran cold. This wasn't going to end well. I gripped my mag light tighter, my knuckles white. The woman in Jensen's body followed him, hissing, "Jensen, this isn't all sorted," Jensen in Bethany's body chirped, bouncing into the living room, a horrific parody of cheerful domesticity. Jake, oblivious, asked the woman in Jensen's body, "You okay, Sonny?" The woman in Jensen's body nodded slowly, playing along, trying to get rid of the psychos. "We talked, and she's going to behave. Thanks for your help. Guys, we'll take it from here." "That's it?" Liam asked, dull-eyed. "That's it," the woman in Jensen's body answered. But Jensen in Bethany's body, the cosmic idiot, couldn't leave well enough alone. "Oh, honey, surely, there's more to it than that. We have to work through everything if we want things to go back to the way they were. If you catch my drift?" The smug, knowing look on Bethany's bruised face was grotesque. That was the last straw. Jake howled. "What is your f***ing problem? Nothing's ever good enough for you." "No, I didn't mean that," Jensen in Bethany's body moaned, clearly tiring of his friend's treatment. The irony, a bitter, metallic taste, was almost overwhelming. "No, I didn't mean that," Matt mocked, giggling. "What a whiny little girl." It was then that Jensen in Bethany's body snapped. "Shut up, you dumb little—" He trailed off, realizing his monumental blunder. "What did you say to me?" Matt whispered, rising slowly from his seat, a predatory gleam in his eyes. Jensen in Bethany's body said nothing, turning pleading eyes to the woman in Jensen's body, expecting her to fix it, to put his friends back in line. The woman in Jensen's body tried. She truly tried. Just calm down, mate." "She's rotten, Jensen," Matt yelled, advancing on Bethany and Jensen's body. "You didn't hit her hard enough, or I hit her too hard," the woman in Jensen's body hurriedly added, trying to defuse the situation with a desperate, fearful laugh. Hit her so hard that she, lost a few brain cells." "Eh?" Matt didn't laugh. His friends didn't stop him. And in the next heartbeat, Matt pounced. He was on Jensen and Bethany's body, a vicious blur of fists and fury. Frankie screamed, finally finding her voice, and ran into the room. The woman in Jensen's body, that poor, trapped soul, lunged to save him, to save her own body. But Jake and Liam were too fast. They muscled her out of the way, holding her back. "This has been a long time coming. Sonny," Jake whispered in Jensen's ear, as Matt reduced what remained of Bethany's body into a pulp. "She's not high value, mate. There is no fixing her. You should have finished her earlier, but that's okay. We'll do it for you. It's what friends do." I watched from the street, my breath locked in my throat, a cold, hard knot of fear coiling in my gut, the sheer, grotesque horror of it. Jensen, the abuser, being beaten to death by his own friends, while wearing the ravaged body of his victim, his eyes in Bethany's face, wide and blood-soaked, finally reflecting the sheer, animalistic terror that Bethany must have known for years. The realization dawning on him that this frail, depleted body had no fortitude, no escape, but even that, I knew, paled in comparison to the horror the woman in Jensen's body was forced to endure, watching her own physical form being systematically destroyed, all hope of returning to her true self dying with every blow. After a minute of relentless aggression, Matt finally stopped. Jensen and Bethany's body lay still. My body stopped moving. "No!" Frankie screamed, finally breaking free of her paralysis, rushing out of the room, through the open front door. "Stop her!" Jake calmly ordered Liam, and that's when I unfroze. The decision was made. The die was cast. My reluctant conscience, my goddamn fatal flaw, had won. I wasn't going to just watch. Not again. With a sudden, explosive surge of adrenaline, I launched myself forward. My worn leather jacket, a second skin, chafed against my shoulders. An elbow to Liam's jaw, a grunt of surprise from him. A knee, hard and precise, to Jake's gut, doubling him over. I slipped between them, past their stunned faces, a ghost in the chaos, and followed Frankie out the door. "Help!" Frankie screamed, darting into the street. Matt, now recovered, hot on her heels. I lunged, arms curling around Matt's stomach, a bone-jarring tackle to the tarmac. We hit the ground hard, the impact jarring my teeth. "What are you doing?" Matt gasped, wrestling in the road. "Get off me, a hole! The bitch saw everything. We have to kill her." I responded with a well-aimed thump to his head, a sickening crack of bone against asphalt. Matt lay still. The ease of it, the cold efficiency, sickened me. My hand, without thinking, went to my wrist, my thumb tracing the dial of my watch. A nervous tick, a grounding mechanism in a world that had just tilted on its axis. Frankie had stopped running, staring at me in silent confusion. "What is happening out there?" Jake called from the front door, his voice laced with confusion. "Jensen?" "What are you doing?" Frankie asked, her voice a reedy whisper. "Frankie, I need you to listen to me," I said, walking slowly towards her. The cold, analytical part of my brain was already working. The cynical part. I had to protect her. I had to get her to understand. "We have to get out of here." "You killed Bethany," she sobbed, stumbling backward, arms outstretched, desperate to escape me. "You're monsters and you're all going to rot in prison. Help!" "It's me, Frankie," I said, trying to infuse my voice with something she'd recognize, some echo of her friend, despite the obvious absurdity. "It's Bethany," she gagged. "You're sick. You're all sick." I had to give her proof. Something only Bethany would know. Something from her past, a shared intimacy. My mind raced, grabbing at fragments. 2007, White House Camp. You told me that you'd never seen anything as beautiful as that blue and purple butterfly. Remember, we were looking up at the stars and... "Don't!" Frankie gasped, haunted by the memory. "That's not your story. It's not something that I would have ever told Jensen," I pleaded, following her down the street as she slowly reversed, not daring to turn her back. "I'm Bethany." "Grab her! Jensen!" Jake yelled from the distance, Liam already moving to obey. "You have to believe me, Frankie," I said, my voice strained. "Why would I lie? There's something wrong with you," she panted. "Somebody, help me!" I made a wish. "Frankie," I said, the words tumbling out, desperate. "I wished to leave my body, and I entered his. He entered mine. Matt killed Jensen, not me." The truth, unvarnished and unbelievable. "Stop it," Frankie wailed. "Just leave me alone. Somebody, please." "You said the butterfly must have had babies in your stomach because that was the way Gary Hurt made you feel," I said, pushing the final, intimate detail, the one that broke through the fear and denial. Why would I know that if I were Jensen? Why would I have ever told him that story? It's me. I'm Bethany. Frankie stopped walking, finally, her eyes, wide and terrified, locked onto mine. I saw the processing happening behind them, The impossible truth clicking into place. The shared secret. The profound intimacy. Something no one else could possibly know. Something Jensen would never have been privy to, no matter how much he tortured her. She looked at me, really looked at me, and in Jensen's face, she saw something she'd never seen before. Emotion. Raw, terrifying, desperate emotion. That's why we came here, I continued, hearing the grunts of Jake and Liam behind me, getting closer. You must know what caused this, Frankie? How I ended up in his body. Why would I know anything about this? She asked, her voice a thin thread of disbelief. I don't know what's happening. Is this even real? I'm having a psychotic break? I saw something. Frankie, it came to me in a hood, offered a way to escape my death. I just had to want it, and he granted that wish in the most awful way, I said. The words a bitter confession. The entity, the thing that had pulled me into its orbit, that had twisted these lives into a new, horrific knot. I told him, Matt interrupted. Suddenly behind me, a hand clamped roughly on my shoulder, his voice raspy. He must have regained consciousness. Told him we shouldn't help you. You're a wimp, Jensen, and you're weak. You were really going to save this bitch over us, huh? We did this for you, but I'm not going to prison for you. I didn't even want to be here. I turned to face him, holding up my hands defensively. Matt, I'm sorry for hitting you. Just let her go and we'll... My words were halted by two firm hands roughly grasping my throat. Liam, the world spun. The night's loop was complete, like some terrifying cosmic punchline. I was back at the start, feeling the life squeeze out of my soul, the crushing pressure on my windpipe, the black spots dancing at the edge of my vision. Why had I been forced to suffer? Why had the unholy being, that cloaked monstrosity, not simply let my nightmare end on that road beneath Jensen's boot? Why had it dragged me into this deeper hell? My struggle was futile. My strength, Jensen's strength, was useless when two men held me down. The clunk of something heavy against flesh and bone brought me back to agonizing life. Frankie. She had bludgeoned Matt's head with a rock, a jagged piece of the very ground we fought on, plucked from the grass beside the road. His body crumpled to the tarmac, lifeless. The grip on my throat released, and I gulped in air, my lungs burning. I don't know what I believe, Frankie whimpered, her eyes darting fearfully to Jake and Liam, who were now racing into the street. How do I fix this? I wailed, the question torn from my raw throat. She shook her head, eyes growing distant, lost in some terrifying memory. I had a friend who told me about... No, it isn't that. What? I cried, backing away from the two approaching men. Tell me. It likes to watch people suffer, Frankie whispered, her voice barely audible, a fragile thread in the encroaching chaos. It saves those at death's door, but always at a cost. What is it? I asked, desperation clawing at my throat. What have you done? Jake yelled, racing forwards and pushing Frankie to the ground. Liam, no! I begged. Just let her tell me what... You've let her hit Matt, Liam interrupted, shaking his head disapprovingly as he approached Frankie's shaking form on the gravel. Jake, I began. My voice choked. This is all a mess. Jensen's friend sighed, as if lamenting a spilled drink rather than a brutal murder. What happened next was neither mercy nor torture. It was simply quick. So horrifyingly quick that my scream, the true gut-wrenching scream of absolute horror, was a second after it was over. Jake crouched beside Frankie, who was shuffling backward on her elbows, tears streaming down her face, and without even a hint of fury, the man cleanly thrust his arm forwards. His concealed blade pierced Frankie's skull so swiftly that she perished with a gawp of horror perpetually stuck on her lifeless face. The utter chilling lack of emotion on Jake's face. The casualness of murder. It was worse than any monster. I screamed and turned on my heel. The world blurred. My worn leather jacket flapped behind me like a broken wing. "Stop him!" Jake yelled at Liam, who was standing with a gormless expression on his face. But Liam was not as fast as Matt, not as strong, not as smart, which was saying something. I ran, my legs pumped, burning, carrying me away from the screams, from the blood, from the unbearable, crushing weight of what I had just witnessed. I never looked back. I never contacted the authorities. What would I even say? I saw a body swap and then a murder, and the killer was a man wearing the victim's body who was killed by his friends, one of whom I then knocked out, and then they murdered the witness who knew me, the one in Jensen's body, who used to be Bethany. No, they'd lock me up and throw away the key. Or worse, they'd send me to a padded cell where I could tell my stories to the empty air. I ran, and I kept running, to a distant town, then a distant city, then a distant country. The truck was abandoned somewhere along the way. Another casualty. I took on odd jobs, anything to keep moving, to stay anonymous. Truck driver, warehouse night shift, security guard, the usual. Just Leo Vance, another ghost in the machine of late-stage capitalism, perpetually moving, perpetually looking over my shoulder. My old wristwatch, a comforting weight, became more of a nervous tick than ever. Despite extensive research, late nights spent hunched over library computers, furtively scanning old texts and forgotten folklore, I haven't been able to find anything about the thing of which Frankie spoke. The hooded entity, the wish granter. But I know it was real. Not only due to the indelible, horrific images seared into my mind, the memory of Frankie's last, silent scream, but due to the shadows. Shadows at the edge of my vision, which forever pirouette out of view when I try to focus on them. I know that hooded thing follows me. It relishes in my torture, the constant, gnawing fear, the knowledge that I was forced to witness such a profound perversion of identity and justice, a hellish existence which never wanes, never ends. I am not trapped in Jensen's body, but I am trapped in the aftermath, trapped by the memory of the man who died before my eyes, wearing Bethany's body as some ghastly outfit. He finally saw the world through her eyes, if only for a moment. He experienced the sheer vulnerability and terror she must have lived with every day. I always wanted him to understand her pain, to grasp the empathy that was so alien to him. But I wonder whether he would ever have truly understood. Empathy and understanding are two sides of a coin. I longed for the former for Bethany, but he settled for the latter, as Jensen was not capable of compassion. Even for the one he claimed to love, and his power, the shadow of his monstrosity persists. I helped Bethany escape him, but I still suffer, for I've lost a piece of myself out there on that road, a piece of my hope, my ability to believe in any kind of justice. No matter where I go, the phantom of that night will forever follow me, and I'll forever be running from the chilling truth that the worst monsters are not the ones cloaked in shadow, but the ones wearing the faces of men. Total characters, 9, 9, and 8, 7. The blue and white cruiser sat like a discarded toy, its engine a silent lie, the faint shimmer of condensation on its windows betraying the frigid pre-dawn air. My breath hitched, a rusty nail in my throat, each inhale a jagged tear at my windpipe. On the hood, folded neatly, lay 2 police uniforms, empty and limp as a broken promise, the cold night teasing their fabric. They were gone, all of them, and the message, scrawled in what felt like my own blood on the steamy bathroom mirror, screamed its truth, echoing the universe's cruel joke. We are everywhere. We are everyone. No safe haven. The world, it seemed, wasn't just indifferent. It was a goddamn farm, and I was just another pig for the slaughter, just like that place beyond the veil. No escape. Never any escape. It had started as it always did, with a quiet wrongness, a subtle shift in the familiar fabric of reality that only I, it seemed, was cursed to perceive. Just an hour earlier, I'd woken on my mother's couch, the worn leather of my jacket digging into my side, an unwelcome guest in a nightmare that was only just beginning to unfold its gruesome petals. My mother, bless her oblivious heart, was off on some cruise, probably sipping overpriced cocktails and complaining about the shuffleboard. I'd been house-sitting for her all week, a temporary anchor in a life lived perpetually adrift. The job was easy enough. Feed the cat, water the plants, pretend I was a normal person for a few days. Up until tonight, it had been the most peaceful stretch I'd had in months. A bland, unthreatening monotony I usually craved. Around 10 p.m. or so, my internal clock tried to tell me, a sound ripped through the quiet suburban night, jarring me from a fitful doze. It was static, not the gentle hiss of a faraway radio, but the raw, unadulterated shriek of white noise, escalating from a whisper to a deafening roar in a matter of seconds. My eyes snapped open, my heart already hammering against my ribs, a familiar terror coiling in my gut. I practically vaulted off the couch, my muscles tensing for a fight, a desperate flight, anything but this sonic assault. My gaze darted to the flat-screen TV across the room, its black mirror now a kaleidoscope of frantic, aggressive snow. I lunged, my fingers fumbling for the power button, desperate to silence the caterwauling banshee trapped within the speakers. The instant the screen flickered to black and the horrific noise evaporated, leaving behind a ringing void, my mind finally tried to catch up, like a broken old engine sputtering to life. Confusion, thick and unwelcome, immediately settled over me. I looked at the very couch I'd just abandoned. I didn't remember falling asleep there. In fact, I could have sworn, with the kind of certainty that usually precedes a profound wrongness, that I had been in her spare bedroom, tucked into the too-soft mattress, attempting to coax some actual sleep from my exhausted brain. My hand instinctively went to my wrist, my thumb tracing the cool metal of my old analog watch, a grounding tick I developed somewhere between the snow-choked mountain pass and the endless highways. I wasn't checking the time. I was checking for some sliver of normalcy, some proof that the world hadn't quite abandoned its orbit, to shake off the lingering disorientation, or perhaps to simply avoid the creeping dread. I forced myself to examine the living room. It was a comfortable, if dated, space with two beige couches, one nestled against the far wall, facing the TV, and the other, my current perch, tucked under the wide bay window. My gaze swept over the familiar clutter, stacks of magazines, a half-finished crossword puzzle, a forgotten coffee cup. Then I saw it, on the window couch, where I had supposedly been sleeping, a crisp, white piece of paper, folded neatly in half. My brow furrowed. Nobody was supposed to be here, not even close. I walked over, my movements stiff, and picked it up. My fingers, calloused from years of gripping steering wheels and warehouse pallets, unfolded it to reveal cramped, almost childish handwriting. Chicken scratch indeed. Spot the differences? My lips curled into a mirthless smile. A prank. It had to be. I'd completely forgotten I'd given a spare key to Sarah a few weeks back. She was always trying to inject some much-needed fun into my perpetually grim existence. "All right, Sarah," I muttered, my voice a rough rasp in the sudden silence. "I'll play." I put the note down on the glass coffee table, trying to project an air of playful exasperation I didn't feel, and scoped out the entire room. The first thing that snagged my attention was my old, clunky desktop computer. It should have been on the small end table beside the wall-facing couch, a dusty monument to procrastination. Instead, it was on the floor, tucked against the baseboard, almost as if someone had just casually kicked it there. Odd, but not terrifying. Sarah was clumsy. The next thing I noticed made the air in the room feel suddenly heavy, thick with unspoken wrongness. My late grandmother's porcelain doll, that goddamn thing, it usually sat on a high, dusty shelf on the wall, a creepy sentinel collecting dust. Now, It was perched directly where my computer had been, its small, painted smile stretched unnaturally wide. I stared into its black, bead-like eyes, cold and vacant, which clashed sickeningly with its garish jester outfit. A prickle of unease, sharp and sudden, snaked down my spine. This wasn't just a creepy doll. This was a deliberate act, a violation. My gut, a loyal but weary oracle, screamed that something was profoundly, irrevocably wrong. It was the same icy dread that had settled in my bones in that quaint diner with Ethan. The feeling that beauty and normalcy were just a thin veneer over something unspeakable. Or when Olivia had smiled at me with those two bright eyes. This was the whisper of something deeply, domestically wrong. A familiar prelude to the chaos that always seemed to find me. My mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but my heart, thrumming a frantic rhythm against my ribs, already knew better. There was no rational explanation for the things that clung to my wake. No simple answers for the horrors that insisted on being part of my narrative. I tried to shake it off, to attribute it to Sarah's twisted sense of humor, but the skin on my arms crawled. My hand brushed against the pocket of my cargo shorts, an automatic gesture. When I sleep, I always keep my phone in my pocket, a lifeline, a window to the outside world. However tenuous, it wasn't there. I patted down my pockets again, then scoured the couch cushions, peered under the coffee table. Nothing. The phone was gone. "Okay, joke's over, babe," I yelled out, my voice sounding strained, a little too loud in the sudden, unnerving silence. My cynicism battled with a growing knot of genuine alarm. This wasn't Sarah. This was something else. I expected a playful giggle, a gotcha from a hidden corner. I expected anything but the response I got. After a few seconds of strained silence, a new sound erupted, not from the living room, but from my mother's bedroom, down the short hall, her ancient, crackling radio, which she only ever listened to for the morning news, suddenly blared to life. Big band music, loud and distorted, a cacophony of brass and drums that sounded less gleeful and more malevolent. The static, I realized with a jolt, had been a prelude. My immediate reaction, one I've never quite understood, was pure, unadulterated fury. Anytime I'm faced with an unexpected, jarringly loud noise, something in me snaps. It's a deep, primal anger that overrides fear. A trauma response I've never been able to trace back to its source, though a part of me always wonders if it's tied to that fire, that chaos from a lifetime ago. I sprinted down the hall, my worn leather jacket slapping against my back, my boots thudding on the thin carpet. I burst into my mother's room, a small, feminine sanctuary now polluted by the sonic assault. My hand reached for the volume knob on the old radio, my jaw tight with a primal need to silence it. I started yelling, for no real reason other than the pure, unadulterated rage that pulsed through my veins. What the hell is going on? Cut it out! Just as my fingers brushed the knob, a female singer's voice cut through the brassy din, clear and chilling despite the blare. Her words, sung with a lilting, almost playful cadence, twisted my stomach into knots. Buried alive, my screams I recall. Years went by. People came and they I slammed the volume knob, twisting it counterclockwise with a savage force that nearly ripped it off. The music, the voice, the dread, all died instantly. But my body moved on instinct. My mind screamed at me, a panicked internal voice clawing at my sanity. Turn it back on. Hear what the hell she was saying. The urge was overwhelming, a sickening fascination with the horror, a cursed curiosity. With a shaking hand, I twisted the knob just enough for the softest whisper of sound. It wasn't the woman's crooning or the big band. It was a popular, catchy pop song, generic and saccharine, playing at a barely audible hum, the kind of song you heard everywhere and never noticed. The transition was so abrupt, so seamless. It was almost more terrifying than the eerie lyrics. It spoke of a deliberate control, a playful cruelty. At this point, the whole spot the differences game had entirely slipped my mind, buried under layers of adrenaline and mounting dread. But when I turned around, it came back in a big, gut-wrenching way. My mother had 3 large, framed family portraits hanging above her bed, a triptych of smiling faces, all from happier, simpler times. But now, to my horror, my own face was conspicuously absent from each one. My head had been meticulously cut out of every photograph, leaving behind gaping oval voids where my smiling face should have been. The sheer, audacious threat of it, the chilling implication, didn't scare me the most. What truly sent a jolt of icy terror through my veins was the impossible precision, the surgical patience, the time someone had taken. They had carefully removed each picture from its frame, severed my head with what looked like an X-Acto knife, then painstakingly replaced the now mutilated photo back into the frame, re-securing it and rehanging it, perfectly straight. I had gotten into my bed, in the spare room, at 9:45 p.m. The door to my mother's room had been open all day, and I never once noticed anything odd. Not a sound, not a flicker of movement, not the scent of a stranger. It was the same sick feeling I'd gotten when I realized Mitch hadn't been Mitch at all, that the imposter had been living in the walls, breathing my air, watching me sleep. They had been inside, right under my nose, and I hadn't known. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. My hand, the one not trembling, went to my watch again, its familiar weight a paltry comfort. I climbed onto her bed, the soft mattress feeling like a trap, to inspect the pictures better, a morbid curiosity overriding every instinct to flee. I needed to see how they'd done it, needed to understand the impossible. Boom! I nearly screamed, a choked, pathetic sound. I shit you not. What sounded like a gunshot, or perhaps a small, controlled explosion, echoed from across the hall, directly from my own room. The sheer, unexpected violence of the noise, the concussive force of it, scared me so badly that I lost my footing on the bed, tumbling forward, my hand, outstretched in a desperate attempt to brace myself, slammed into the bed frame, then slid across the glass of one of the picture frames, now shattered from my fall. A sharp, searing pain shot up my arm as the broken glass bit deep into my palm. At this point, any sensible person would just leave, right? Any sane, self-preserving human being would have turned tail and bolted, screaming into the night. I knew I should have. My go bag, always packed and ready, was probably still by the door. My mind screamed at me to run, to sprint out of this nightmare house, this domestic tomb, but it felt like my body was being pulled, inexorably, towards my room, like an invisible string had been tethered to my chest, tugging me deeper into the abyss. It wasn't courage, it was a horrifying compulsion, a twisted form of my reluctant conscience, pulling me towards the source of the dread. Perhaps because a part of me, the part that hated itself, felt I deserved to see the next horror. With my back pressed against the cold wall of the hallway, a sliver of broken glass still embedded in my palm, I slowly, excruciatingly slowly, opened the door to my room. A shriek, raw and involuntary, tore from my throat when I saw what was inside. It wasn't just a few things moved around, not a simple spot the differences game. It was a complete, utter upheaval. Everything was changed. Every damn thing in that room had been moved to a different area, rearranged into a chaotic, incomprehensible tableau. My bed, usually neatly made, was now against a different wall. My dresser was overturned, clothes spilling out like guts. It was a deliberate act of violation, a grotesque mockery of order. But amidst the chaos, there was only one thing out of place in a new, terrifying way. A folded piece of paper sat on my pillow, pristine white against the rumpled fabric. I walked numbly towards it, The broken glass in my hand, a dull throb compared to the hammering of my heart. I unfolded the note. Let's get obvious. The handwriting was even worse than the previous note, almost frantic, as if scrawled in haste or intense excitement. As I put down the note, my gaze, drawn by an unseen force, drifted straight ahead. My bedroom is right next to our raised back porch, with sliding glass doors serving as the barrier between my sanctuary and the outside world. A knot the size of a bowling ball, cold and heavy, grew in my stomach as I looked at the small table on the porch, visible through the glass. Bob had been set up right in the middle of it. Bob. As a side job, my mother teaches CPR classes for the community, and Bob is one of the 7 life-size dummies we have for those sessions. He was supposed to be in the garage, stacked with his plastic brethren. Now, he was being propped up, eerily upright, by what looked like an old, rusty pipe jammed into his back. His rubber mouth, usually agape for artificial respiration, was now covered by a black leather ball gag, cinched tight, and worse, much worse, 2 gleaming, wickedly sharp hunting knives had been plunged into his plastic eyes, reflecting the dim porch light like malevolent stars. It was a mutilation, grotesque and deliberate, a horrifying tableau. But what scared me the most about Bob's performance was the message, scrawled crudely in red paint, or something that looked like it, on his torso. Locks couldn't keep us out. My blood ran cold. The implications hit me with the force of a physical blow. Not only had they been inside, not only had they meticulously rearranged and violated my space, but they had also done it with absolute impunity. The thought dragged me back to that empty, burned-out shell of a house in Sycamore Grove, the one I can barely remember, the one that should have protected my family. Locks, walls, doors. They meant nothing. They never had. Then, just as the full weight of that realization settled, I heard them, footsteps, under me, coming from the basement. My mouth slowly dropped open. A choked gasp caught in my throat. I froze, my every nerve ending screaming, trying to count the heavy, deliberate thuds. 1, 2, 3. From what I gathered in those 5 eternal seconds, 3 distinct sets of heavy, dragging footsteps were moving around down there, directly beneath me. Just like that, my body, usually so weary, kicked into a primal overdrive I hadn't felt since running from that hungry thing in the woods beyond the old farmhouse. No more reluctant conscience, no more morbid curiosity, pure, unadulterated survival. My go bag was probably still where I left it, but there was no time. I spun on my heel, sprinting out of my room, down the short hall, and towards the front door. Every fiber of my being screamed for open air, for escape. A cold sweat beaded on my forehead. I was scared out of my mind because the door to the basement, a heavy, bolted wooden slab, was practically beside the front door. They were between me and the only clear exit. My hand was already on the cold metal of the doorknob, twisting it, desperation clawing at my throat. I hadn't even looked out the peephole, hadn't registered anything beyond the blinding need to get out. But then I heard it, a low, gravelly voice, deceptively calm, from directly outside the door, just inches from my ear. No, there's no leaving. I nearly got whiplash with how quickly my neck snapped upwards. My gaze shot to the front door's small, rectangular window, the kind you'd find on a suburban house. Standing there, silhouetted against the weak glow of the street lamp, was a very built person. They wore a plain blue mechanic's outfit, pristine and unblemished, and a stark, featureless white mask. The kind of blank, empty mask that chills you more than any ghoulish grin. It was too perfect, too clean, like the skin on Olivia's carpet, so neatly arranged, so horrifyingly human. It seemed like the 5 seconds we locked eyes through that pane of glass stretched into 5 hours, a lifetime of frozen terror. The blankness of the mask was a void, absorbing all light, all hope. But this person, this entity, broke that illusion of stasis when he suddenly, casually, slammed his fist into the door's window. Not only did this send a jolt of pure terror through my chest, giving me a mini heart attack, but it also produced a spiderweb of cracks across the glass. The thought of that blank-faced man, so easily breaching my last barrier, coming into my house, into my mother's house, into this space that was supposed to be safe, snapped me fully into survival mode. There was no fear to freeze me up, only a chilling, desperate clarity, an almost mechanical assessment of threat and escape to help me live through this. As I'm writing this, huddled in the borrowed warmth of a neighbor's guest room, I still don't know why I did what I did next. My lips, cold and numb, curled upwards. I smiled right at the man, a wide, unsettling grin, a desperate, defiant act of absurdity in the face of absolute terror. I knew that at least 4 men were either in my house or trying to get in, that the odds were stacked impossibly against me, but I smiled right into his damn blank face. It was the only shred of control I had left, a final middle finger to the cruel, indifferent universe that seemed determined to break me. Then, without breaking eye contact for another agonizing second, I turned around and started sprinting towards the back door. I could hear the man on my front porch yell, "Fuck!" as if he hadn't expected me to react, hadn't anticipated my suicidal defiance. Good. Let him be surprised. The back door, it felt miles away. My lungs burned, air rasping in and out, the smell of dust and old fear filling my nostrils. Once I reached the back door, yanking at the old deadbolt, I heard the heavy basement door creak open behind me, followed by a torrent of heavy, stomping footsteps. Closer now, gaining on me. But before they could even all get out of that damn door, I was already halfway down my backyard porch steps, clumsy and desperate. The cool night air hit my face, sharp and invigorating. Once I reached the bottom, I risked a glance behind me. The large, rusted gate that led into my backyard, usually bolted shut, was wide open, swaying slightly on its hinges. And standing in the gaping maw of the opening, silhouetted by the distant streetlights, was the man from earlier, the one in the mechanic's outfit and the white mask. This time he was brandishing a baseball bat, its dark gleam a promise of bone-shattering pain. I didn't even look again to see if he was chasing me, didn't wait to see if the others had spilled out of the house. I just ran. I sprinted towards my back fence, a rickety wooden barrier that separated my property from a patch of dense, neglected woods. My muscles screamed, but I launched myself, scrambling over the top, the rough wood scraping my already cut palm. I landed hard on the other side, a painful thud, and immediately started screaming for help, my voice raw and hoarse, tearing through the suffocating silence of the night. I barely registered the small patch of woods behind my house, the gnarled trees reaching like skeletal fingers. But luckily, by some miracle, a few teenagers were there, huddled around a dying bonfire, chugging hard iced tea and probably getting up to no good. My frantic screams, my disheveled appearance, and the terror plastered across my face must have been convincing enough. It didn't take much of my incoherent, panicked story to convince them to let me use their phone. The only girl there, a blonde with wide, shocked eyes, shoved hers into my trembling hand. I fumbled with it, dialing 911, my fingers slick with sweat and blood. I explained everything, the whole unbelievable, sanity-shattering nightmare, to the operator. She was calm, professional, telling me that squad cars were on their way, but that none of us were safe out in the open. "Find shelter, sir, immediately." So, and with a nod to the teenagers, we all ran, a desperate, terrified huddle, towards my neighbor's house. If you're reading this, Daryl, thank you for letting us in. You probably think I'm insane, but you let us in. The cops arrived 4 minutes later, sirens wailing, lights flashing, a brief, fragile beacon of hope in the darkness. They swept the house before doing anything else. guns drawn, flashlights cutting through the gloom. They didn't find anybody there. No blank-faced mechanic, no silent accomplices, no sign of the 3 sets of footsteps from the basement, but they did find a bunch of horrifying tools set up down there. The sheriff, a big man with weary eyes, described them in vague, chilling terms. Restraints, sharpening stones, some kind of staging area. They assumed that I must not have been paying attention to the basement much, that I was just a negligent house sitter who missed a meticulous home invasion. I tried to reassure them, tried to argue, my voice cracking with desperation. That's impossible, I insisted. I went down there today, around 8:30 p.m., to play Xbox. It was empty. There was nothing. The sheriff shook his head, a gesture of tired disbelief. That's impossible, son. The whole setup they had down there would have taken at least 3 hours to put together. Minimum. The time frame of the crime didn't add up for any of us. A gaping void in the narrative that defied logic. They also questioned how I didn't wake up when I was supposedly moved from my bed to the couch, or when they rearranged my entire house. Talking to them honestly felt like a really bad nightmare sequence from a David Lynch movie, a surreal, Kafkaesque interrogation. It didn't feel real. None of it did. The police, who weren't for all their authority, couldn't grasp the true nature of the violation. They saw a break-in. I saw the unraveling of reality. I'd dealt with authorities before. After that phantom hitchhiker incident, after the things I'd seen on the road, they always looked at me like I was a liar or a lunatic. Always. Most of the cops left around 11:45 p.m., leaving behind a single squad car parked outside in my driveway, a silent blue and white guardian in case I needed them. I convinced my mom to stay on her cruise, assuring her everything was fine, that it was just some vandals. I felt a fragile sense of safety with the cop car sitting there, its presence a thin shield. Besides everything being moved, things felt relatively normal now, a strange, eerie calm after the storm. Until I entered the bathroom. It was a room where I hadn't spotted the difference. I hadn't dared. It was my last bastion of normalcy, or so I hoped. The fluorescent light hummed, casting a sterile glow. Then my eyes found the floor. Soap was all over it, like some deranged cleaner had gone wild. My shower curtain, a simple floral print, was shredded into long, hanging strips, like bloody ribbons. My breath caught. I saw a glint of white behind the toilet. My phone, the missing phone, it was there, wrapped neatly, meticulously, in toilet paper. And then I saw it, painted on the steamed-up mirror, in that same atrocious, desperate hand, was the final message. The punchline to the universe's cruelest joke: we are everywhere. We are everyone. No safe haven. I audibly said, "How the fuck?" The words were barely a whisper, a broken plea. My mind raced, trying to process it. Why wasn't this told to me by the police? Why was this room not brought up at all during their sweep? Had they missed it? Or had it happened after they left? A fresh wave of paranoia, colder and sharper than anything I'd felt tonight, washed over me. The cop car, the sense of safety. It was a lie. It was always a lie. My heart began to race again, a frantic hummingbird trapped in my chest. I ran, stumbling, into my living room, my gaze fixed on the front window. The squad car still sat in my driveway, a silent, mocking testament to my foolish belief in external protection. But it was empty. Nobody was in it. Instead, those 2 police uniforms, freshly folded, sat on the hood, catching the first pale light of dawn. They were an offering, a warning. I tried calling 911 again, my fingers fumbling with the toilet paper-wrapped phone, but it wasn't working. Dead. No signal. My neighbors, Daryl and his wife, weren't home, even though they had been 30 minutes ago. 30 minutes. Enough time for anything to happen. I'm not trying to write a cliché the author dies at the end story, because right now, as the sun begins to creep over the horizon, painting the sky in sickeningly cheerful hues, I'm very much alive. My hand throbs, my muscles ache, and my mind feels like shattered glass. But I'm worried that I won't be for much longer. If I somehow survive this, I want to share my story. I want to ask all of you, out there in the vast, indifferent darkness, if you have ever been in a situation like this one where everything almost feels normal, where the pieces seem to fit, but in fact, everything, every subtle change, every deliberate violation, every single second of it seems to be contributing to your death. This isn't just a house invasion. This is a message, and I am its unwilling recipient. Character count 9H7. The air crackled, not with static electricity, but with something far fouler. A smell like ozone and burnt plastic clawed at my throat, stinging my eyes, and then Edward's face, a distorted, pixelated caricature of the man I used to know, stretched and contorted, pushed through the shimmering surface of my laptop screen. His eyes, twin white voids, stared, not at the screen itself, but through it directly into mine, locking me in a gaze that felt impossibly cold. A grotesque, sickening pop echoed in the small room, the sound of impossible pressure being released, and then a hand, elongated and twitching, covered in the green-blue glow of the monitor, clawed its way out. The sheer, physical impossibility of it brought a cold, numbing terror that froze the breath in my lungs. It was an obscenity, a violation of reality itself, and it was reaching for me, a digital wraith becoming flesh right before my eyes. It hadn't always been like this. Before the pixels turned to pseudo-flesh, before the screen became a gateway to a digital hell, there was just the unsettling quiet of a life lived on the fringes, and the familiar, nagging feeling that I should have known better. It always started with a feeling, a subtle wrongness, a whisper of a lie that humanity, in its infinite hubris, had decided to call progress. This time, it began with a dead man's online ghost and my own goddamn cursed curiosity. My life, as it often was, had been a series of temporary landscapes and disposable jobs. A few months ago, I'd been stuck on the night shift at a data archiving facility outside of Fargo, a mausoleum of blinking lights and humming servers, where the air was always too cold and smelled faintly of ozone and regret. That's where I'd met Edward. Not a friend, not a colleague in any meaningful sense, just a presence. He was the kind of guy who didn't just understand technology, he seemed to believe he could commune with it. Wiry, intense, with eyes that saw something beyond the physical. Even then, he'd wear those thick-rimmed glasses perched on his nose, always hunched over a console, muttering to himself about gray code and the etheric layer of the internet. Claims that most of the crew dismissed as the usual tech bro eccentricity, just a little more unhinged than average. I, on the other hand, had seen enough unhinged to recognize a different flavor when it presented itself. Edward was obsessed with the human consciousness. Not AI, he'd corrected me once, a flicker of something dark in his eyes when I dared to use the term. AI is an imitation, he'd said, leaning too close, smelling faintly of stale coffee and something metallic, like burnt circuitry. The true future is ascension, uploading the very soul. I just grunted, probably adjusting my worn leather jacket, trying to keep my expression neutral. I wasn't interested in his philosophy. My philosophy revolved around getting through the shift without incident, getting paid, and getting out of town before anything stuck. But Edward, like a particularly persistent burr, seemed to have decided I was a captive audience. He'd corner me by the coffee machine, by the vending machines, even in the dead, echoing silence of the server rows, ranting about quantum entanglement and digital immortality. He'd pull out diagrams that looked like occult symbols rendered in circuit board patterns. I'd nod, feign interest. check my old analog wristwatch out of habit, willing him to finish. He just wanted someone to listen, someone to acknowledge his genius. My fatal flaw, I suppose, is that I often let my guard down just enough to be polite. I never did anything to provoke him, never challenged his theories, just politely dismissed his invitations to join his research. Maybe that was enough. My quiet disinterest, my inherent skepticism, perhaps even my mere survival, was an affront to him. Edward died 3 months after I left that job, electrocuted in his garage, the news report said, found amidst a tangle of wires, custom-built hardware, and scorched circuit boards. An unfortunate accident, they'd called it. I remember thinking, figures. You play with fire, you get burned, or in his case, fried. A grim end for a grim man. I'd packed up my 2 duffel bags, one for clothes, one the go bag, cash, flashlight, protein bars, water, a basic first aid kit, and driven west, finding myself in a nondescript apartment in a nondescript town, working nights at a shipping depot. For a couple of weeks, the silence was almost deafening, the kind of silence that usually preceded something truly awful. Then the messages started. The first one was a comment on a photo I'd posted to a burner social media account, a mundane shot of a sunset over a distant mountain range. It was a fake name, a throwaway account, almost 0 followers. That was the point of it, anonymity. The comment simply read, "Nice sunset, Vance, still chasing horizons?" My blood ran cold. Edward's profile picture too, grinning out at me. I'd blocked the account years ago. Instagram's security was, in my experience, annoyingly effective. It shouldn't have been possible. I immediately assumed someone had hacked Edward's account, or that it was a sick joke from one of his equally unhinged relatives. Ryan, Edward's cousin, always had a sadistic streak. I reported it. The account was suspended. Good. Problem solved. Or so I told myself. Except it wasn't. The comments, always from Edward's defunct account, always with his pixelated grin for a profile picture, began appearing on other platforms. A dead man's digital ghost. My throwaway email started receiving strange attachments. Not spam, but code. Cryptic, alien strings of symbols that looked less like programming and more like a fever dream. Each email, a single subject line. Remember gray code? My old, battered Nokia flip phone, which I used for emergencies and nothing else, started receiving empty calls, sometimes just a burst of white noise, sometimes a high-pitched whine that grated on my teeth. Buster, my scruffy terrier mix, usually a creature of calm, stoic devotion, started getting antsy. He'd follow me from room to room, his nose twitching, his low growl a constant undercurrent to the artificial hum of the cheap apartment. He'd fixate on the modem's blinking lights or the TV screen when it was off, whining softly. Animals see things. I've learned things we're too blind or too afraid to acknowledge. I was afraid. All right. This was different from the whispers in the old house, different from the chill that followed the hitchhiker, different from the unnatural warmth of a certain skin collector's parlor. But it was the same underlying wrongness. It was like the world was peeling back another layer, showing me another brand of teeth, a digital one this time. Still, I tried to rationalize it. Someone with a vendetta, someone with too much time and too many technical skills. Police were useless. Cyber harassment, they called it, scribbling on their notepads, their eyes glazing over the moment I mentioned dead men in gray code. "We'll investigate," they'd mumbled, sending me off with a patronizing pat on the shoulder. My faith in institutions was already at an all-time low. This just hammered the last nail into that particular coffin. A week ago, I found myself lying in bed, Buster curled at my feet, his breathing slow and rhythmic. The cheap digital clock on the bedside table glowed 2:17 a.m. I'd been tossing and turning, my mind refusing to quiet down. The night was a heavy blanket of silence, broken only by the occasional distant siren or the murmur of the old building settling. And then, a sudden ping, a jolt through the quiet. My laptop, sitting open on my desk across the room, less than a foot from the end of my bed, had flared to life. The screen, a pale blue rectangle in the gloom, hummed. I hadn't left it on. Hell, I hadn't even left it switched on. My stomach tightened, a familiar coil of dread. Buster stirred, a low, rumbling growl starting in his chest. His ears were flat against his head, pointed at the laptop, a dark silhouette against the faint glow. The screen scrolled, silently, slowly. It wasn't my desktop. It wasn't even my browser homepage. It was Edward's profile on Facebook. Who the hell still uses Facebook? It was like a digital mausoleum, a relic from a forgotten past. This was a whole new level of intrusion. My fingers twitched, itching for the baseball bat I kept tucked under the bed. Even though I knew it was useless against whatever this was, a hacker, it had to be a hacker. Ryan, probably, trying to scare me. Or worse, trying to blame me for Edward's stupidity. The scrolling stopped. My breath caught in my throat. I was staring at an old photo, Edward and I, at a work gathering years ago. It was from the early days, before his darkness had fully shown itself, before his ambition had curdled into something monstrous. We looked normal, almost happy. A lie. It was always a lie. "All right, Ryan," I murmured, my voice a dry rasp in the quiet room. Buster whined in, pressing closer to my leg. "You've made your point. It's my fault he's dead. Just cut the crap already." Then the photo moved. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Buster let out a sharp, anxious bark, then whimpered. My eyes, wide and unblinking, were glued to the screen. I and everything else in the picture remained perfectly still, frozen in a moment that was long dead. But Edward moved, his head tilted, a slight, almost imperceptible shift. Then he detached himself from the background, a subtle shimmer around his edges, and began to walk. No, not walk, glide. He glided over to the photographer, his pixelated form growing larger and larger, expanding, engulfing every square inch of the full-screen image until his face, now horribly close, filled the entire monitor. My dead acquaintance, Edward, was staring through the laptop screen, staring at me. The white, soulless eyes were already there, even in that old photograph. I just hadn't seen them then. I'd been too busy trying to ignore the truth. "What the hell is this?" I breathed, my voice thin and reedy. This wasn't some deep fake. This wasn't Ryan's twisted sense of humor. This was impossible. My mind raced, clawing for a rational explanation. A video embedded in an image? No, that wasn't how it worked. Not like this. Not that fluid, that organic, that wrong. And then his voice. "Hello, Vance," Edward said. His voice was a mangled echo, as if someone had recorded it, then run it through a meat grinder. It was garbled, crackling like static on an old radio, yet undeniably his. My chest tightened, a cold knot of dread. Had he recorded himself to torture me from beyond the grave? Was this some elaborate, posthumous, digital trap? "You look, well," his inhuman voice gushed, the words dripping with something slimy, something that made my skin crawl. "I like your new routine, the late nights. Very efficient." He knew my habits. He knew my name, my burner accounts, my location. He'd been watching, always watching. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Buster was growling steadily now, a low, continuous sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Edward's demeanor shifted, mirroring the man I'd briefly known. The charming facade, always thin, always brittle, began to crack. His pixelated head tilted even further to one side, a grotesque parody of curiosity. His smile, which had been stretched unnaturally wide, now tightened, brimming with pure malignancy. The dead man's charm, if it could ever be called that, vanished. His pupils, too, were fading, diluting into the sickly white of his irises. Seconds later, all that remained were two blank, empty, milky spheres, like scarred-over wounds. It was as if I were seeing the real Edward at long last, the subhuman thing that had lain dormant beneath his thin shell of intellect and ambition. A thunderous, thudding sound sent a shockwave through my body, vibrating the floorboards. It was a sickening, squelching sound, like something wet being pushed through something tight. Horrified, I watched Edward's hands pressing against the shimmering screen of my laptop. Not just his hands, his whole body. He was pushing, as if he were trapped underwater, struggling against a surface that rippled and distorted with every effort. The screen continued to flex inward, bending, bowing, creaking with a sound that wasn't right, a sound that wasn't possible for electronics. It was the sound of something alive, something struggling. My breath hitched. A guttural scream tore itself from my throat, raw and desperate. I finally accepted it. This wasn't Ryan. This wasn't any digital prank. This wasn't anything that could be explained by earthly rhyme or reason. This was the same brand of impossible horror I'd been running from my entire adult life, just manifesting in a new, technologically advanced form. I wasn't going to wait for my undead abuser. Never again. Not after all I'd seen. Not after all I'd run from. Not after the Sycamore Grove incident, which still clawed at the edges of my memory like a phantom limb. I scarpered from my bed, Buster barking frantically at my heels, beelining for the door of my room. My go bag was right beside it. Just get out. That was the mantra. Just survive. Before I could reach the door, a blinding flash of light erupted from my laptop screen. It was so intense it burned pinpricks into my vision. The door, which I'd left ajar, swung shut with a violent slam, shaking the thin walls. A piercing sound, like a ghastly cry of agony, emitted from the speakers of my laptop. It was Edward's voice, amplified, distorted, a shriek of digital pain that made my teeth ache. "You're not leaving me again, Vance," Edward's mangled voice commanded, rattling the very air. I rotated slowly, my eyes still watering from the flash, to face the digital entity that was slithering free from my laptop screen. The screen itself was stretching around him like elasticated rubber, clinging to his grotesque form as if unwilling to let him go. The thin bezel of the laptop frame groaned under the impossible pressure. When he finally escaped his digital prison, Edward's long limbs, still glowing with the sickly blue-green luminescence of the screen, glitched ghoulishly before me. His arms twitched, his legs buckled, his body seemed to flicker, like a bad connection, before solidifying, becoming more substantial with every agonizing second. He adjusted his posture, the sounds of his movements like 1,000 tiny tearing sounds, standing upright and gazing upon me with those horrible, white, empty eyes. My stalking specter widened his fiendish, Cheshire cat grin. "I found a way to live forever," he whispered, his voice still ragged, but gaining strength, becoming more human, more insidious. "If you join me, Vance, I promise we won't ever fight again. We can be infinite." Buster was a fury of barks and growls, a small, courageous bundle of rage, trying to get between me and the nightmare. I tried the door again, furiously twisting the handle, rattling it. It was being held shut by an invisible, unyielding force, as if bolted from the other side. Twisting my head to look at the monstrous creature behind me, I whimpered, a sound I hated, a sound of absolute terror. Edward slowly stumbled towards me on unsteady, glitching legs, toppling his head to one side, a chilling echo of his old mannerisms. I screeched at the top of my lungs, a primal, animal sound, and turned back to face the door, desperately yanking the handle, trying to rip it from its hinges. That was when I had a dreadful idea, a stupid idea, a suicidal idea. But it was an idea. I darted towards my bedside table, swerving past Edward's outstretched, flickering arms. His reach was impossible, extending unnaturally as I moved, a visual distortion of space. Buster yelped, startled, but stayed right on my heels, snapping at the air around Edward's legs. My hand closed around a half-full glass of water, left there hours earlier. The plastic felt slick in my sweating palm. I turned to face my ex-acquaintance, my former tormentor, now something else entirely, something alien. His lips parted, and a pit of blackness was revealed within his mouth, a vacuum of pixels. That same high-pitched wail erupted from the caverns of his demonic body, the sound of 1,000 dial-up modems screaming in agony, a sound meant to shatter eardrums. He knew what I was about to do, knew it from the look in my eyes, the desperation in my stance. Without a moment's thought, a primal surge of self-preservation overriding every ounce of rational fear. I launched the glass of water at the digital ghoul that was lumbering towards me. It spun end over end, a slow-motion arc of shimmering water molecules. The plastic tumbler, cheap and flimsy, hit Edward square in the chest. Water exploded across his shimmering, translucent skin, soaking his flickering form. Edward screamed, not the digital wail from the speakers, but a robotic cry so deafeningly loud, so utterly devoid of humanity, that my ears popped, a sharp, painful pressure. His eyes, those milky white voids, widened into perfect circles of pure horror. As the water soaked through his unnaturally glowing form, he began to spasm manically, his body glitching and contorting with violent, uncontrolled jerks. He shuddered, his unbound digital form retreated, dissolving back into the shimmering, rippling effect of the screen. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the laptop screen reclaimed him, pulling him back into its confines, the digital surface bubbling and churning as he was sucked in, pixel by pixel, limb by limb. The last thing I saw was his wide, white eyes, burning with furious, frustrated malice, before the screen snapped back to normal, displaying a generic login page. A faint wisp of something that smelled like ozone and burnt toast lingered in the air. My bedroom door swung open with a creak, as if the invisible force that had held it shut had suddenly dissipated, its concentration broken. I didn't hesitate. Buster was already halfway out. I seized my opportunity, my go bag already in hand, and fled my flat, leaving the laptop, the lingering smell, and the fresh layer of trauma behind. I have been living in my car for the past few days, moving from one anonymous town to the next, sleeping in the back seat. Buster curled tightly against me. The cheap motel rooms feel too vulnerable now. Too much technology. Too many outlets. This is the first time I've used any substantial technology since the incident. Huddled in a corner booth of an all-night computer cafe, its fluorescent lights humming, the air thick with stale coffee and desperation. There are plenty of people around, a comfortable hum of chatter and keyboard clacks, and I don't think Edward would be stupid enough to come for me in a public place. But who knows, what's stupid to a thing that can pull itself from a screen? I just needed to write this down, to get it out of my head before it completely consumed me. I keep seeing flickering screens out of the corner of my eye. Every phone, every tablet, every glowing billboard feels like a threat, a potential window for him to peer through, to push through. Every reflection is suspect. Should I just get off the grid entirely? Melt into the wilderness? Avoid technology for the rest of my life? I can't run. He's everywhere now. He is the ghost in the machine, and he knows my name. Character count 9,784. My phone vibrated, a low, insistent hum against the clammy palm of my hand. The display, cracked in a familiar spiderweb pattern, lit up with an unread message notification. My stomach, already tied in a knot tighter than a sailor's hitch, gave another sickening lurch. It was an attachment, a video file. I knew, with the cold certainty of a man who'd seen too much, that opening it was a mistake. But the morbid curiosity, that damn reluctant conscience, always wins. My thumb hovered, then pressed. The screen flickered to life, showing a distorted, grainy feed of what was unmistakably the kitchen of that godforsaken cabin. Me fumbling with a lighter and an aerosol can, my face slick with sweat, eyes wide with a terror I still felt in the marrow of my bones. Then Emily, her jaw set, a wild desperation in her gaze. Every jerky frame was a fresh spike of ice through my chest, a rewind of the horror I'd barely outrun. The final shot was of my own face, contorted in a scream as the shadows converged outside, followed by a close-up of the ranger's bewildered, then determined, eyes as we piled into his truck. And then, the message, stark white against the black screen. "We'll be watching." My breath hitched. A ragged gasp caught in my throat. My old analog wristwatch, a nervous tick more than a timepiece, felt heavy on my wrist. I glanced at it, the hands still, unmoving, as if time itself had shattered alongside my peace of mind. Then, a faint, almost inaudible whisper, dry as rustling leaves, seemed to seep from the phone's tiny speaker, slithering into the quiet room. A voice I knew, too well, from the endless night. "Stay." My reflection shimmered in the screen. But it wasn't just my reflection. Behind me, a tall, elongated shadow, a formless hunger, coalesced into a figure. Its glowing eyes, like dying embers, stared back from the periphery of my vision, not just from the screen, but from the dark corners of the room. It was watching, always watching. 3 days before that cursed video landed in my lap, I was just Leo Vance, a worn-out man with a worn-out leather jacket, driving a beat-up old pickup truck and trying to outrun a past that kept pace with me, mile for weary mile. I'd taken the job as a glorified chauffeur for a distant acquaintance's kid, fresh out of some high school, and his insufferably cheerful family. A graduation trip to a secluded cabin in the northern woods. Sounded like a sentence to me, but the pay was good, cash up front, and it was far enough off the beaten path to keep me out of trouble, or so I hoped. My old analog wristwatch was already getting a workout, my thumb absently tracing the cool metal of the crown, a nervous habit that had saved my sanity more times than I could count. Or, perhaps, had merely delayed its inevitable unraveling. Buster, my scruffy terrier mix, snored softly in the passenger seat, oblivious to my usual low-grade dread, his presence a constant, anchoring weight in the chaos of my life. He was the one bright spot, the only thing that tethered me to anything resembling sanity. God help me if anything happened to him. The drive itself was typical for these parts, miles of winding, poorly maintained asphalt giving way to an even worse gravel track, flanked by a wall of pines so thick they seemed to drink the light from the sky. The air grew colder, crisper, carrying the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and still. Northern wood, they'd said, more like northern mausoleum. The very silence out here hummed with an unnatural tension, the kind that made the hairs on my neck stand up long before anything actually happened. I'd grown to recognize that hum. It usually meant trouble, my own personal brand of trouble. We pulled up to the cabin an hour past sundown. It was less a rustic retreat and more a sprawling, over-manicured lodge that stuck out in the wilderness like a polished coffin at a pauper's funeral. "Honeydew Haven," a quaint wooden sign declared, swinging slightly in the phantom breeze. My gut twisted. Nothing this pretty in the middle of nowhere was ever good. The first thing I noticed, even before I killed the engine, was the stillness. Not the peaceful kind of stillness, but a clinical, almost sterile silence. It was the kind of quiet that meant everything was exactly where it should be, and nothing was allowed to disturb it. And then the plants. Everywhere. Potted ferns, sprawling philodendrons, towering ficus trees, all impossibly vibrant. Their leaves a shocking, almost artificial green in the fading light. They filled every window, every corner, like living sentinels. Emily, a young woman I'd picked up a few towns back, a college student on a gap year, looking for a ride north, gasped beside me. "It's beautiful. Leo, look at all the greenery." She was the kind of relentlessly optimistic person who usually set my teeth on edge. But tonight, her easy enthusiasm was a strange comfort, a reminder that normal people still existed, even if I wasn't one of them. The kid, some fresh-faced graduate named Michael, tumbled out of the back seat with his parents, all of them radiating the kind of naive excitement that made me want to grab them by the shoulders and yell, "Run!" But I didn't. I just swung my legs out, stretched my stiff back, and reached for Buster's leash. He bounded out, sniffing the pristine gravel with an intensity usually reserved for finding a discarded sandwich. Inside, the cabin was even more unsettling. Spotless. Not just clean, spotless, but no one has ever lived here spotless. The scent of lemon polish hung faintly in the air, masking the deeper, more organic smell of the abundant plant life. Every surface gleamed, every cushion was plumped, every book on the shelves aligned with unsettling precision. It was a showroom, not a home. My eyes, always scanning, noted the lack of dust, the absence of any personal clutter, no stray magazine, no forgotten coffee cup ring, nothing. "Unpack the bags. Leo, please," Michael's mother chirped, already halfway to the kitchen, presumably to inspect the state-of-the-art appliances. I grunted, pulling my own worn duffel and the always-ready go bag from the truck bed. Buster padded silently beside me, his tail a low thump against my leg. He seemed to pick up on my unease, his usual playful energy muted. While they dispersed to explore their dream getaway, I wandered, ostensibly to find a good spot for my gear, but mostly to gather intel. The living room was dominated by a massive stone fireplace, its hearth unnaturally clean, as if no fire had ever warmed its maw. A pool table and dartboard sat in a brightly lit game room, framed by more plants. My gaze snagged on a framed photograph on a side table. A large family dressed in vaguely old-fashioned clothes, their faces unnaturally vibrant, their smiles wide and frozen. Their eyes, though, they were the unsettling part, too bright, too fixed. They seemed to follow me. I chalked it up to the bad lighting, but a prickle of unease snaked its way down my spine. Later, after a silent dinner where Michael's parents chattered about golf and real estate, I found myself in the game room with Emily. She was surprisingly good at pool, her competitive streak bubbling to the surface as she trounced me, shot after shot. I feigned exasperation, trying to inject some levity into the strange, quiet hum that seemed to permeate the cabin. It was a good distraction, her easy laughter. For a moment, I almost forgot where I was. I excused myself to use the bathroom. It was one of those sprawling, spa-like affairs, all polished chrome and gleaming porcelain. I turned on the shower, letting the steam fill the air, trying to wash away the lingering sense of unease. As the water hammered against my skin, I glanced up, something in the perfectly white ceiling tile catching my eye, a small, almost imperceptible black dot. My observational skills, honed by years of trying to stay one step ahead of the things that hunted me, kicked in. My gut clenched. That dot wasn't a defect. It was too perfectly round, too dark against the pristine white. I turned off the water, the sudden silence amplified by the dripping faucet. My heart started to thrum a little faster, a frantic drum against my ribs. I reached up, my fingers brushing against the tile. It was slightly loose. I pushed. It gave way, revealing a small, dark cavity. Inside and nestled snugly in a custom-made hollow was a camera, tiny, black. Its single, unblinking lens stared back at me like a dead eye. An icy wave of revulsion, cold and swift as a mountain stream, washed over me. My breath caught, my hands trembling as I pulled it out. It was heavy, professional grade, and active. A tiny red light pulsed almost imperceptibly at its base. My mind reeled. Violation. That's what this was. A cold, calculating violation. My own skin suddenly felt too thin, too exposed. The room, which had seemed so spacious, now felt claustrophobic. The polished surfaces reflecting back a distorted, panicked version of my face. "No," I whispered, the sound swallowed by the bathroom's antiseptic quiet. "Not again. My memories, the ones I couldn't quite touch, the ones that whispered in the dark corners of my mind, stirred. A cold fire, the smell of burning wood and ozone, a primal fear rooted deep in my childhood. Sycamore Grove. The name was just a feeling, a phantom limb of a memory. But the terror was real. This invasion, this feeling of being watched, it clawed at that same unhealed wound. I stumbled out of the bathroom, clutching the camera like a venomous snake. My first instinct was to run, to grab Buster and my go bag and vanish into the night. But the others, Michael, his parents, Emily, they were here. My reluctant conscience, that damned inconvenient spark of decency, flared. I couldn't just leave them to whatever this was. I needed to know. My eyes darted around the living room, now seeing the cabin's pristine perfection not as an amenity, but as a meticulous deception. The vibrant plants, the carefully arranged decor, they were all part of the mask. My gaze fell on a large potted fern in the corner, its fronds impossibly lush, too lush. My fingers probed the soil. Hard plastic, not soil at all. Beneath the fake leaves, another camera. This one angled perfectly towards the main seating area. Panic, cold and sharp, began to truly set in. I was no stranger to paranoia, but this was different. This was tangible, methodical. I tore through the cabin, a silent, frantic phantom. Behind a framed landscape painting, another lens. Within the intricate carvings of an antique grandfather clock, a pinhole camera. Even in the kitchen, camouflaged within the faux wood grain of the pantry door. The entire cabin was wired. Every laugh, every conversation, every intimate moment, all recorded, all watched. Who and why? My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. Prank? No, this was too elaborate, too precise. Someone wanted to see them, see us. A chilling thought bloomed in my mind. What if this wasn't about watching at all? What if it was about collecting? Like a collector of rare butterflies, pinning them to a display board. My frantic search brought me to the bookshelf in the living room, a massive, ornate thing filled with untouched, decorative volumes. My hand brushed against a section of the spine that felt oddly loose. I pushed. A faint click, a false panel. My fingers, still trembling, slipped into the narrow gap. Inside, tucked away in the darkness, was a leather-bound journal. Its pages were brittle, yellowed with age. I pulled it out, my heart hammering against my ribs. It felt impossibly heavy in my hands, as if burdened by the weight of forgotten horrors. I flipped it open, the faint scent of mildew and something else, something metallic and acrid, rising from its pages. The handwriting was cramped, frantic, in a dozen different hands. Not entries from previous guests, but a collection of confessions, warnings, desperate pleas. They watch, always, from the walls, from the trees. The silence is a lie. They are listening. The plants, they are not just plants. They are their eyes. I skim through entries, each one a fresh stab of dread. Stories of fleeting shadows, of objects moving, of whispered names in the night. And then, the ones that made my blood run cold. Accounts of people vanishing. Not just leaving, but vanishing. Without a trace, no cars, no luggage. Just an empty cabin and a fresh entry in the journal. One particular entry, scrawled in thick, desperate strokes, seemed to leap off the page, its ink still vibrant, as if written only moments before. They watch, and they wait. If you stay, you'll never leave. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, plastering strands of hair to my skin. My mouth was dry, tasting of ash. This wasn't a prank. This was a trap. We weren't just being watched, we were being hunted. And those glowing eyes in the photo, were they the collectors? Just then, the cabin lights flickered, a brief, unsettling blackout that plunged the room into near total darkness before the lights hummed back to life, weaker now, casting long, dancing shadows. A guttural, scraping sound echoed through the cabin, a sound like something impossibly large dragging itself across splintered wood just beyond the walls. It was low, primal, and too close. It froze me in place, the journal falling from my numb fingers to land with a soft thud on the pristine floor. "Emily!" I yelled, my voice a strangled croak. "Michael, get up! We have to go!" I raced to the game room, then to the living room where Michael's parents were supposedly watching a movie. The scraping sound grew louder, accompanied now by a faint, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. A heartbeat, perhaps, or something else. Emily was already standing, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. She'd heard it too. "Leo, what was that?" "No time," I hissed, grabbing her arm. "The others, are they awake?" We found Michael and his parents. They were deep asleep, sprawled on the couch in the armchair, their breaths unnaturally shallow, perfectly synchronized. It was too uniform, too still. A sickening realization dawned on me. They weren't just asleep. They were under some kind of spell, the same pervasive hum I'd noticed earlier. The one I'd dismissed as quiet now felt like a low-frequency drone, vibrating through the floorboards, holding them captive. They weren't just observed, they were being prepared. "We have to wake them," Emily urged, shaking Michael's shoulder, but he merely lolled, unmoving. "It's no good," I muttered, my voice grim. "They're out cold." I thought of the camera in the bathroom, the one in the plant, the journal. They knew we were here. They wanted us to stay. A splintering crash from the kitchen startled us. Something big, something inside. "The door!" I yelled, pulling Emily towards the main entrance. "The windows!" We tried the front door first, locked, not just bolted, but sealed, as if the very wood had warped and fused with the frame. I slammed my shoulder against it, but it held firm, mocking my frantic efforts. I tried the windows. They wouldn't budge either. It was a steel cage wrapped in wood and glass. The whispers began then, soft at first, like wind rustling through dry leaves, but rapidly gaining volume, pressing in from all sides, from the walls, from the floorboards, from the very air itself. "Stay, stay, stay." "We're trapped," Emily whispered, her voice cracking. Her face was ashen, her eyes fixed on the impenetrable windows, where shadowy forms were beginning to press against the glass, their shapes distorted, elongated, impossibly tall. Their eyes, glowing like dying embers, peered in, mirroring the eyes from the photograph. My old habits kicked in. Scan, assess, find the weakness. The walls, the glass, the wood, all too strong. But there was another element, the things outside, the shadow figures. They wanted us to stay. Yes, but they also seemed hesitant, wary of breaking through entirely. Perhaps they couldn't. Not fully. Not yet. My gaze snapped to the fireplace. Stone, unyielding, but the firebox, a chimney. Maybe a desperate thought, but how to draw attention, how to create an escape route. Fire, a desperate, insane plan formed in my mind. Stay here, I ordered Emily, though my voice trembled. Get Buster, stay hidden. I ran to the kitchen, the whispers following me, growing louder, more insistent. Stay, Leo, stay with us. A cold dread, deeper than anything I'd felt before, settled in my chest. They knew my name. They had been watching for a very long time. I snatched a can of aerosol cooking spray from the pantry, my fingers fumbling with the nozzle. My old reliable Maglite would have been better, heavier, but it was in my go bag, still in the truck. A cruel irony. I grabbed a lighter from a drawer. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The scraping sound from the kitchen intensified, now punctuated by heavy guttural breathing. Something was close, very close. I spun around, just as a vast, distorted shadow detached itself from the wall, writhing like a half-formed limb of darkness. It shimmered, solidified slightly, and two pinpricks of crimson light flared in its indistinct mass. Eyes. They were the eyes from the photo, the eyes from the reflection I'd glimpsed just moments ago. I screamed, a raw, animal sound I barely recognized as my own, and squeezed the lighter. The small flame caught, dancing precariously. I aimed the aerosol can, a ridiculous weapon against a primordial horror, but it was all I had. The gas hissed, turning the tiny flame into a roaring torch, a gout of fire that licked at the darkness, pushing it back. The shadow recoiled with an audible, guttural hiss, a sound like dry leaves scraping over stone. It seemed to shrivel, momentarily pushed back by the heat, by the light, but it wasn't gone. It merely withdrew, merging with the deeper shadows of the kitchen. This was my chance. My eyes scanned the room, landing on the ornate, heavy curtains in the living room, made of some kind of thick, velvety material, highly flammable. Not ideal, I thought grimly. Not if I wanted to survive, but I needed a distraction. I needed to break the spell, and I needed to scare the hell out of whatever was out there. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I ran to the living room, the flickering torch in my hand. The whispers were a deafening roar now, swirling around my head, inside my head. No, don't. Stay. I jabbed the makeshift torch at the heavy velvet curtains, the fabric catching instantly, bursting into an angry orange bloom. Smoke billowed, thick and black, filling the cabin with a suffocating haze. The smoke alarm shrieked, a piercing, deafening wail that tore through the air, shattering the pervasive, silent hum that had held Michael and his parents in their unnatural slumber. Their eyes snapped open. Confused, disoriented, they coughed and gagged in the smoke-filled air. Emily, holding Buster, was already there, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and fierce determination. "The door!" I yelled, pointing to the front door, which now, thanks to the alarm, thanks to the noise, seemed to have lost its impossible seal. The wood groaned, a faint splintering sound as if the cabin itself was in pain. "Now, run!" I slammed my shoulder against the door again, this time with a surge of terror-fueled strength. It splintered, bursting inwards with a final, protesting shriek of wood and metal. We tumbled out, a chaotic mass of stumbling bodies, into the suffocating darkness of the forest. The air was frigid, biting at my lungs and thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something metallic and rotten, like old blood. The shadows were everywhere now, not just outside the cabin, but in the trees between the branches, their elongated forms writhing and twisting like monstrous tendrils reaching for us. Their glowing eyes were everywhere, red pinpricks of malice in the oppressive blackness. closing in. The whispers were deafening, screaming in my ears. "Stay! You'll never leave! Stay!" Buster, bless his brave little heart, was a blur of frantic fur beside me, his low growls a counterpoint to the terrifying chorus. I clutched Emily's hand, dragging her forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Michael and his parents were blindly following, their initial confusion replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. We ran, stumbling over roots, crashing through undergrowth, the shadows at our heels. I could feel their presence, a cold, hungry pressure against my back, their whispers scratching at the inside of my skull. It was like running through a nightmare, a familiar, sickening sensation. This wasn't the first time. It felt like it had always been this way. Me running from the things that clawed at the edges of reality, things that wanted to pull me back into the dark, running from the faint, forgotten scent of burning wood and ozone. Then, through the trees, a beacon, a glint of metal, a flash of red light, a vehicle, a ranger's vehicle, parked, oddly enough, just off a rarely used logging trail. Divine intervention, or another carefully laid part of the trap. I didn't care. It was our only shot. "Over there!" I screamed, my voice hoarse. "Help! Please!" The ranger, a burly man with a grizzled beard, was leaning against the front fender, staring up at the canopy of trees, as if he'd been expecting us. His eyes, though, they weren't glowing, just human. Startled, he straightened, his hand going to his hip. He looked from us to the writhing shadows behind us, his face a mask of disbelief turning to grim understanding. He'd seen something. He had to have. "Get in!" He bellowed, yanking open the back door. We piled in, a desperate, gasping tangle of limbs and fear. I shoved Emily in first, then Michael's parents, then Michael himself, finally throwing myself in just as a particularly massive, distorted shadow lunged, its skeletal fingers brushing against the truck's tailgate. A shiver, colder than any winter wind, shot up my spine. The air inside the truck felt thin, electrified. The smell of rotten meat, like old blood and formaldehyde, filled my nostrils. They had almost caught us. The ranger slammed the door shut, shoved the truck into drive, and the tires spun, spitting gravel as he floored it, tearing down the logging trail, leaving the shrieking shadows and the burning cabin behind. We didn't look back. We couldn't. Days later, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit confines of a hospital waiting room, I recounted the horrors to skeptical authorities. They wrote it off as a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning from the smoke and collective hysteria. They found the cabin scorched, yes, but no cameras, no journal, just an empty shell of a building, except for one thing. "Sir," the lead investigator said, his voice clipped, "we found marks on the interior walls, deep, like something tried to claw its way out, or in." He paused, his gaze lingering on me for a moment too long. Too large for any animal we know. I merely nodded, my face a carefully constructed mask of weary indifference. They didn't believe me, not fully, but they'd seen enough to know something had happened, something unnatural. Just another notch on the long, dark tally of my life. Another memory to sketch into my journal. Another face of the monstrous to pin to the page. Another reason to keep moving, to keep running, to keep looking over my shoulder. My phone vibrated, that familiar hum, and I already knew what it was. The collector, the watcher, and the whisper. Always the whisper. "Stay." But I wouldn't. Not this time. Not ever again. I squeezed Buster's paw, his fur soft beneath my thumb. We were survivors, him and I. And in this terrifying, watchful world, that was all that mattered. Character count, 2 characters. The phone buzzed, a malevolent mosquito on the scarred nightstand. My breath hitched, a rusty gear sound in my throat, each inhale a painful rasp against the raw lining of my lungs. Dawn was still hours away, the kind of inky blackness that swallowed streetlights whole, leaving the world a suffocating void. My hand, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled for the device, my fingers clumsy and unresponsive, as if the cold dread in my gut had leached all warmth and dexterity from them. The screen glowed, a cold, clinical light against the pervasive darkness of the cheap motel room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stale air. One message, unknown number. You left the door unlocked. My blood ran cold, a glacial torrent through my veins. The words a hammer blow to a memory I didn't even know I possessed, yet they echoed with a sickening familiarity. The phantom click of the deadbolt, a sound I'd meticulously ensured moments ago, echoed in the sudden, absolute silence, a mocking counterpoint to the terror that had just blossomed, black and viscous, in my chest. I stared at the flimsy wooden door, then at my trembling hand, the one that had so carefully, so knowingly, engaged the deadbolt, the chain, the flimsy latch, double-checking it, triple-checking it, as I always did. No, impossible. It had been locked. It had to be. But then, the faint, almost imperceptible sound of a whisper, carried on the stagnant, mildewed air that now permeated the room, slithered into my ear, a serpentine hiss that promised nothing but oblivion. It wasn't just outside anymore. It was in here, with me. It began, as all things do, with a whisper, a faint, almost imperceptible current in the stagnant, heavy air of a town I swore I'd never seen before. A place I'd only stopped in for a night shift that promised anonymity and a few dollars. My worn leather jacket, a second skin against the chill, felt heavier than usual, a constant reminder of the road stretching behind me and the uncertainty ahead. I'd picked up a gig stacking crates in a warehouse outside of town, the kind of backbreaking, no questions asked work I preferred. Kept my head down, kept moving. That was the rule. Don't look too close. Don't linger. But this town, this particular neighborhood, with its crumbling sidewalks and graffiti-stained walls, felt strangely, horrifyingly familiar. I'd always considered myself an expert in the art of avoidance. My life was a perpetual motion machine, a frantic blur of highways and forgotten towns, each one a temporary refuge from the last. Running was an instinct. Honed by years of practice, it kept me alive. But sometimes something snagged, something pulled at that deep, inconvenient well of curiosity I still somehow possessed despite all attempts to bury it. This time, it was the street. Not just its decay, though there was plenty of that. Broken windows staring like vacant eyes, porches sagged like broken smiles, a symphony of structural failure. No, it was the heaviness in the air, a physical pressure that seemed to press down on your chest, making every breath feel deliberate, as though the very streets were holding their breath, waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets. I'd first noticed it on my way back from the warehouse. Dawn still a bruised purple smear on the horizon. My shift had ended, the clanging of metal and the drone of forklifts replaced by the profound, unsettling silence of a sleeping town. That's when I saw it. A perfect, untouched blueberry muffin perched delicately on the edge of a cracked planter outside what used to be a nail salon. It wasn't just the incongruity of fresh pastry in a landscape of urban decay. It was the deliberateness of its placement. Too neat, too pristine. Right, I muttered to myself, rubbing a thumb over the cold steel of my old analog wristwatch. A nervous tick I'd never managed to break. Someone's having a bad morning, or a weird art project. My internal monologue, usually laced with sarcasm, felt particularly flat that day. I kept walking, dismissing it as some strange local quirk. Every town had them. But then, the next night, there was a chicken drumstick, balanced precariously on the crumbling steps of an old church. its glossy surface catching the faint light from a distant streetlight, unnervingly pristine against the grimy stone. My brow furrowed. Coincidence, I told myself. A kid dropped their dinner, but my survivor's gaze, always scanning, always assessing, picked up the subtle wrongness. No ants, no flies, just perfect, like a still life, arranged for a morbid display. Soon it seemed every forgotten corner had its offering. Apples, their skin unblemished, resting on discarded tires. Candy bars, wrappers still sealed, tucked into the hollow of a broken fire hydrant. Jars of peanut butter, sliced clean in half, exposing the creamy interior, balanced on the rim of overflowing dumpsters. The strangest, perhaps, was a tin of sardines, unopened, balanced on the edge of a splintered wooden fence, glistening as if freshly placed. "Okay, Leo," I whispered, my voice rough with exhaustion and a growing unease. "This isn't just weird. This is actively unsettling." I'd been in enough strange places to know when things weren't just quirky, but wrong. This felt wrong down to my bones. It prickled the hairs on my neck like a static charge, reminding me of that snow-choked mountain pass, the icy grip of fear, the impossible whisper of a dead man's voice, the kind of wrong that made you want to put a few hundred miles between you and it, and then never look back. I tried to convince myself it was some weird ritual. Maybe an offering to gods I didn't believe in, a desperate plea from a forgotten community. But then I started seeing the symbols, tiny marks, etched in Sharpie or scratched crudely into the pavement next to the food. The first one I saw was next to the chicken drumstick, a jagged, almost childish drawing of a house with an X over it, and beneath it, scrawled letters. I followed her there and took them out. A chill, cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, traced a line down my spine. The words were cryptic, almost nonsensical, but the more I saw them, the more they began to feel intentional. A malevolent scavenger hunt. Each time, that same icy tendril of dread would creep up my spine as I wondered who or what was leaving these messages. "The children lied," read another, etched into the sidewalk beside a perfectly preserved bag of potato chips near a decaying playground swing set. And the one that truly made my stomach clench, "Her time is up," written beneath a single, bruised orange near a broken window of what must have once been a family home. The more I noticed, the harder it became to ignore. The symbols were everywhere and scattered across our crumbling landscape like a breadcrumb trail designed by something that didn't want to be found, but wanted to be followed. My gut screamed at me to get back in my truck, drive until the gas tank was empty, and then keep driving. But something kept me tethered. A perverse fascination, maybe, or that damnable, stubborn spark of responsibility that always seemed to flare up at the worst possible moment, dragging me into situations I knew I should avoid. I found myself imagining some poor, lost kid stumbling upon one of these offerings, picking up an apple, and then, what? The thought made my skin crawl. Paranoia set in quickly, a creeping vine of unease that strangled every moment of peace. I'd catch shadows in my peripheral vision, faint and fleeting, as if something darted just out of sight, just beyond the edge of perception. And then the whispers came next, low and indistinct, like a conversation I wasn't meant to hear, but couldn't escape. They wrapped around me, a suffocating shroud of sound, sometimes a single, drawn-out word, sometimes a jumble of syllables that made no sense, yet conveyed an undeniable threat. The air seemed to thicken around me during those moments, pressing against my skin, and the distant creak of a loose gate or the shuffle of unseen feet sent my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I found myself subconsciously mapping the town, connecting the dots of where the symbols appeared, noticing that they clustered in certain areas, places people wisely avoided after dark. I started carrying my heavy-duty Maglite flashlight, the kind that could crack a skull if needed, and a cheap folding knife I'd bought at a truck stop. My go bag, always packed and within arm's reach in the motel room, felt like a tangible representation of my dwindling sanity. I even bought a cheap notebook and pen, a desperate attempt to bring order to the chaos, to document what I found, as if writing it down could somehow make it less real, less threatening, or maybe, just maybe, it was an unconscious act of defiance, an attempt to understand the enemy before it devoured me whole. One night, as I flipped through my hastily scrawled notes under the dim glow of a desk lamp in my motel room, tracing the crude drawings of the symbols, I swore I heard a voice whispering from the corner of my room. "You'll never find them in the daytime," it hissed, almost gleefully, the words chilling my blood like a sudden plunge into an icy lake. My heart raced, a frantic drum against my ribs, as I whipped my head around, finding only shadows, deep and oppressive, clinging to the corners of the room. It was the same voice I'd heard on the street, distorted, malevolent, and undeniably here. That's when I decided, foolish, I know, but some part of me, that damned reluctant conscience, needed to know, needed to understand, needed to see what lay at the end of this twisted trail. I had to venture out after dark. The street lights, sparse and sickly yellow, barely pierced the heavy cloak of night. The air tasted of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old blood. Each step was deliberate, my boots crunching on loose gravel, the sound magnified in the unnatural silence. My maglite beam cut a shaky path before me, illuminating discarded wrappers, shattered glass, and the occasional glint of fresh food, each offering a small, terrible beacon drawing me deeper. My old wristwatch, its face dulled by countless bumps and scrapes, felt cold against my wrist as I fiddled with the crown, a futile attempt to ground myself. My twisted trail led me to an abandoned house on Sycamore Street. Even from a block away, it stood out, a gaping maw of decay amongst the lesser ruins. It looked like it had been waiting for me. Its windows stared blankly, jagged black holes against the moonless sky. The porch, collapsed and splintered, stretched open like a jagged, hungry grin. This wasn't just a derelict building. It was a mausoleum, a monument to forgotten horrors. And something about it, something about the way the peeling paint curled like desiccated skin, the way the broken steps sagged under their own weight, triggered a vague, unsettling flicker in the back of my mind, a sense of déjà vu, of nightmares half recalled. On the rotting steps, bathed in the anemic glow of my flashlight, a bag of chips sat atop a freshly scrawled message, the Sharpie ink still gleaming wetly. He wouldn't give it to me. I took it. The words felt like a direct challenge, a malevolent dare flung at my feet, urging me to step inside. My hands shook so violently the flashlight beam danced across the grimy facade, painting ephemeral patterns of dread. Every instinct screamed at me to turn, to run, to forget I'd ever seen this place. But that damnable, stubborn part of me, the one that always wondered what lay beyond the veil, pushed me forward. My fingers closed around the cold, grimy doorknob, and with a guttural sigh, I pushed open the creaking door. The air inside was a suffocating shroud, thick with the stench of rot, mildew, and something else, something cloying and sweet, like stale blood and decaying meat. Every creak of the floorboards beneath my boots seemed to echo my own frantic heartbeat, a macabre percussion section for my mounting terror. The walls were streaked with grime, a greasy black film that seemed to writhe in the dim light. Broken furniture lay scattered like the remains of a violent struggle. Overturned chairs, a splintered table, a ripped sofa whose stuffing spilled out like intestines. It was as if a hurricane had passed through, but a hurricane of pure, concentrated malice. As I stepped into what must have once been the living room, my breath caught in my throat. I heard it, slurping sounds, wet and guttural, like a ravenous beast feeding in the dark. It was coming from the shadows at the far end of the room, near the remains of what looked like a fireplace. My flashlight, clutched in a white-knuckled grip, trembled violently as the beam, a thin, desperate spear of light, fell upon a hunched figure. At first glance, in the deceptive play of light and shadow, it looked human. A large, stooped man, perhaps bent over some grisly meal. My mind, desperate for normalcy, tried to rationalize it. A homeless person, a squatter. But as it slowly turned, disturbed by the sudden intrusion of light, its face, or what passed for a face, was grotesquely, indescribably wrong. Its features seemed to melt and shift, like a poorly molded wax figure left too long in the sun. Eyes, too many of them, or perhaps just too large, rolled independently in puddles of what might have been fluid. A mouth, impossibly wide, distended to reveal a maw of uneven, jagged teeth, slick with something dark and glistening. Its skin was mottled, a sickly gray-green, with patches that seemed to bubble and deflate, like a decaying fruit. A wet, sickly sound, something between a gasp and a cough, escaped its throat. I take from them, the liars, the fakers, to feed. It rasped, its voice a sick parody of human speech, a gurgle of phlegm and malice. The words were the same ones I'd been following, the same cryptic messages etched into the sidewalks outside. A cold, iron certainty settled in my gut. This was it. This was the source. This was the thing. And it was looking at me, its multiple eyes focusing with a predatory intensity that stripped me bare. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the floorboards, paralyzed by a terror so profound it vibrated through every cell of my body. Before I could even formulate a scream, before my brain could send the desperate signal to my legs, it lunged. It wasn't a run, more like an impossibly fast slither, a gruesome blur of melting flesh and grasping limbs. The putrid smell of it, rancid and sweet, filled my nostrils. That snapped me out of my trance. Survival. Always survival. I turned and ran, a raw, primal shriek tearing from my throat, leaving my mag light and any lingering shred of bravery behind. The sound of its pursuit was a horrible symphony of wet snarls, wheezing breaths that sounded like a bellows struggling for air, and the sickening, squelching slap of its, whatever they were, against the floorboards. It echoed in my ears, chasing me through the labyrinthine darkness of the house. I stumbled over broken debris, my hands scraping against grimy walls, the rotten air burning my lungs with every ragged gasp. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into its grotesque form, every creak of the old house a step closer. My legs burned, screaming for rest, but the fear-fueled adrenaline drove me onward. I burst out of the back door, tearing through an overgrown, neglected yard, the thorny bushes tearing at my clothes and skin. But I felt nothing but the desperate need to escape. The creature's distorted voice, somehow clearer now that I was outside, bellowed after me, a promise delivered on a gust of foul air. I will follow. My current lodgings, the cheap motel I checked into, came into view, its blinking neon sign a beacon of false safety in the oppressive dark. I sprinted, fueled by pure, unadulterated terror, my heart threatening to explode from my chest. I threw myself against the motel door, fumbling with the key card, my hands shaking so violently it took 3 tries to slide it correctly. The lock clicked with agonizing slowness. I burst inside, slamming the door shut, twisting the deadbolt, sliding the chain, engaging the flimsy latch. Every click a desperate prayer for security. I collapsed against the door, my body racked by tremors, hot tears blurring my vision. The sound of my own ragged, desperate breaths was the only proof I was still alive. A harsh, guttural sound in the sudden, ringing silence of the room. I slid down to the floor, my back pressed against the door, clutching my knees, trying to still the frantic rhythm of my heart. My old wristwatch, still on my wrist, felt impossibly heavy. I spun the crown, a useless, frantic gesture. I didn't sleep at all that night. How could I? Every creak of the building, every distant car, every rustle of the cheap curtains sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, lurking in the shadows. I could feel its presence, a cold, predatory gaze fixed on my window. I tried to convince myself it was just exhaustion, a nightmarish hallucination brought on by lack of sleep and too much caffeine. But the offerings continued. I knew they did, even if I couldn't see them, and so did the symbols. Sometimes I'd hear faint scratching at the window, a light, deliberate sound that set my teeth on edge, or the distant echo of its voice, carried on the stale night air, a chilling whisper that promised retribution. I'll follow. I spent the next few days holed up in that motel room, only venturing out for work, moving like a ghost, eyes darting, ears straining. I ate canned food, anything that didn't resemble the offerings I'd seen. Sleep was a battle I constantly lost, each attempt shattered by the whispers, the scratching, the sheer, oppressive presence of something that wanted me. I started sketching, a new, desperate habit. My hands, once just tools for labor, now moved with a frantic urgency, trying to capture the melting face, the too wide mouth, the endless eyes. I sketched the symbols, the layout of the abandoned house, anything to pull it out of my head, to pin it to a page where I could look at it, study it, and then, perhaps, turn the page and forget. It was a futile gesture, I knew, but it was all I had. Last night, the fear, a cold, heavy stone in my stomach, reached a fever pitch, just as the first anemic sliver of light was attempting to pierce the darkness. I found a note slipped under my door. It wasn't in my handwriting. That much was clear. The paper, a cheap, flimsy sheet, smelled faintly of mildew and something else, something cloying and sweet, familiar from the house on Sycamore Street. The ink was smeared as if written in haste, the letters uneven, almost childish, yet radiating a malevolence that curdled my blood. "You can't hide forever," it read. My heart sank, a leaden weight dragging me down. I clutched the knife I now kept under my pillow, the cold steel a small comfort against the overwhelming dread. Somewhere outside and in the pre-dawn quiet, I heard it, the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps. My breath hitched. They weren't distant, they were coming closer, each step deliberate, heavier than the last, echoing in the absolute silence of the motel corridor. The air in the room grew colder, that same acrid, sweet smell filling my nostrils, tightening my throat. I knew then, it wasn't just following me, it had been here. It knew. It knew I was here. I didn't sleep at all that night, clutching the knife in my trembling hand as the darkness pressed in around me, alive with unseen things. The thing out there was patient. It knew the fear it had planted in me would only grow. And it was right. Just before dawn, the sound of the footsteps stopped. Silence blanketed the house, oppressive and unnatural, thick enough to choke on. As I dared to exhale, a shaky, shallow breath. My phone buzzed on the bedside table. I jumped, nearly dropping the knife. The screen lit up with a single message from an unknown number. My fingers were still trembling as I unlocked it, the words burning themselves into my retina, searing themselves onto my soul. "You left the door unlocked." End of chapter. The shriek tore through the drywall, a sound born of agony and something ancient, something that peeled back the thin veneer of normalcy. My hands were already at my old wristwatch, fingers tracing the cool metal, a nervous tic I'd cultivated over too many sleepless nights and too many close calls. This wasn't just a domestic squabble spiraling out of control. The glass splintered, not in the apartment across the hall, but inside her head. I saw the shadow, the impossible growth pushing through bone, felt the psychic crackle in the air, and witnessed the horrifying shift from terror to something far, far worse. It had all started, as these things always did, with a bad decision dressed up as a temporary job. A way to keep moving, to keep the past just out of reach. Another city, another dead-end night shift, another layer of grime on the soul. This time, it was a low-paying security gig for a dilapidated apartment complex on the outskirts of what passed for a thriving metropolis these days, the kind of place where the silence was always pregnant with unseen things, where the air hung heavy with the residue of countless lives lived in quiet desperation, and where the peeling paint felt less like neglect and more like an insidious disease. I'd taken the job because it was late nights, minimal interaction, and it paid cash. The perfect setup for a ghost like me. I remember my first round on the third floor, the scuff of my worn work boots on the stained carpet. The stale smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the lingering aroma of cheap microwave dinners and desperation. I was checking locks, making sure no enterprising junkie had found a new way into the laundry room. When I first heard them, voices, a man and a woman, from apartment 3B. Arguments weren't unusual in places like this, par for the course. But these voices, even muffled by a few inches of plaster and a thin door, carried an unnatural edge. The woman's voice was too soft, too pleading, and the man's, a deep baritone, occasionally fractured into something else entirely. A low growl, a guttural snarl that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I chalked it up to a bad temper, maybe a few too many beers, and kept moving. My job was to keep the residents from killing each other in the hallways, not to play marriage counselor through the walls. My conscience, a rusty, seldom used tool, remained stubbornly sheathed. A week passed. The late shift was mind-numbingly dull. My only companions were the flickering fluorescent lights in the hallways, the occasional squeak of a rat in the walls, and the ever-present low hum of the building's decaying infrastructure. I'd lean against the wall in a forgotten corner, scrolling through blurry photos of dilapidated motels on my phone, already planning my next escape. Just 2 more weeks, I told myself. Just enough to fill the gas tank and stock up on enough instant coffee to keep the world at bay for another 1,000 miles. Then I was gone, another city wiped clean from my internal map. But the voices from 3B continued their nightly ritual. Not every night, but enough for me to notice. Enough for me to subconsciously alter my patrol route. Lingering a little longer on the 3rd floor, my head tilted just so, trying to discern the nuances of the domestic drama unfolding within. It wasn't curiosity, not exactly. More like the hypervigilance of a veteran soldier hearing distant gunfire. You don't want to get involved, but you also need to know if it's coming your way. My watch, my old analog friend, seemed heavier those nights, its ticking a stark reminder of the slow, grinding march of time. One evening, I heard a crash. The sound of breaking glass, sharp and violent, sliced through the usual hum of the building. My stomach twisted. "Don't get involved, Vance. It's not your fight." My usual mantra. But then the woman's cry, a raw, choked sob, followed by a voice, the man's, that had completely lost its human cadence. It was deeper, rougher, like rocks grinding together, laced with a venom that wasn't just anger, it was hate. A primal, consuming hate that felt older than the building, older than the city, older than me. It reminded me, vaguely, of another sound I'd heard, a whisper in a snow-choked mountain pass. Too cold, too close, from a phantom that shouldn't have been there. A shiver, colder than any winter wind, traced a path down my spine. My reluctant conscience, that festering wound in my soul, chose that moment to act up. It screamed at me. Someone is in pain. Someone needs help. I hated that voice. I'd learned, the hard way, that helping rarely ended well for Leo Vance. It just meant more scars, more trauma to add to the growing pile in my head. But the scream, it was too much. It clawed at something deep inside me, something I usually kept buried under layers of cynicism and self-preservation. Maybe it was the memory of a past failure, a person I couldn't save, a fire I couldn't stop. The details were still fuzzy, locked behind a mental block, but the feeling lingered, a constant, dull ache of guilt. I found myself outside apartment 3B. My hand hovered over the door, knuckles brushing the cold metal of the handle. My heart hammered against my ribs, a drum solo of dread. The cheap wood of the door felt thin, fragile, barely a barrier. I could hear the man's voice, now a full-blown roar, punctuated by the woman's whimpers. "You think you're lonely?" he snarled, the voice somehow louder, clearer, despite the barrier. Then another crash, a heavier sound this time, something solid hitting a wall. "You know what, bitch?" My breath hitched. This wasn't just an argument, this was a demolition. And the voice, it was wrong. Too much bass, too much raw, unadulterated aggression. It wasn't just a man yelling. It was something else speaking through him. I'd seen it before, or something like it. Not like this, not exactly, but enough to know the chilling difference between human rage and something far, far worse, like the way Ethan's eyes had gone utterly dead before he started carving, or Olivia's unsettling stillness before her true nature unraveled. My internal monologue, usually so quick with a sarcastic quip, was silent, replaced by a cold dread that numbed my extremities. Your company is far from satisfying. What with your stupid goddamn rants about inequality, this injustice, that, the voice mocked, shifting now, strangely, into a patronizingly high-pitched, whining tone. It was a grotesque mimicry, designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. You ever stop and think you're just making all that shit up? Or maybe things are the way they are for a reason, to keep you safe? My hand was still on the doorknob, but I didn't turn it. I couldn't. Not yet. I was a man who'd seen things that didn't fit into any sane worldview. But even I hesitated. This wasn't just a threat. It was a psychological attack, a dismantling of someone's reality. It felt intimate, violating. The woman's gasps were growing more frantic, choked, as if she were trying to hold back something enormous, something on the verge of erupting. Just how many times do I have to tell you this until it gets through your thick, fat skull? He is not your friend. The voice seethed, its words sharp as daggers, radiating a palpable sense of possession, of absolute control. All he wants from you is what every man wants from every woman, and what he wants is mine. That last word, mine, was delivered with a possessiveness that chilled me to the bone. And then, a new sound. A wet, sickening squelch. Not the sound of a fist, or a body hitting a wall. It was something internal, something organic, a sound that made my stomach lurch. And with it, a faint, nauseating odor began to seep from under the door. Not human waste, not garbage. Something older, like a cellar that had been locked for centuries, filled with damp earth and something that had rotted and festered beneath it. The smell of decay, of slow, creeping corruption. My hand flew to my mouth instinctively, to ward off the stench. I heard the woman's muffled yelp of pain, sharp and immediate. "What the fuck?" Her voice, though still choked, had changed. It had a new edge, a new resonance. And then, the male voice, the demon's voice, colder, more clinical, even as it was laced with a cruel satisfaction. "What the fuck is wrong with you?" That was it, the line. My reluctant conscience, having dragged me this far, finally shoved me over the edge. No more. This was beyond domestic dispute. This was something inhuman, preying on the vulnerable, and my soul, as scarred as it was, couldn't stand by. I didn't care about the consequences, about the fresh trauma. I couldn't just walk away and let whatever that thing was finish its work. Not after all I'd seen, all I'd barely survived. I gripped the doorknob. It was cold, slimy almost, though I knew it was just my clammy hand. I twisted it. The lock clicked with surprising ease. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, revealing a scene that solidified every horror I had ever witnessed, every nightmare that had ever clawed its way from my subconscious into the waking world. The apartment was a wreck. A glass lay shattered against one wall, sparkling shards scattered like malevolent diamonds on the worn carpet. A framed photograph, likely of the couple, lay face down near the doorway, its glass cover splintered. The air was thick with the cloying, putrid scent I detected, now stronger, tinged with something metallic, coppery, blood, and there they were. Daniel, the man, stood by the far wall, his face a mask of shock, eyes wide, mouth agape, seemingly transfixed by the woman on the floor. She was huddled against the base of the sofa, knees pulled tight to her chest, trembling, but it wasn't just fear that racked her. Her hands were pressed against her forehead, and between her fingers, I could see two dark, gnarled protrusions, like black branches tearing through skin. They were horns, raw, bleeding, utterly impossible. And then I saw her fingernails, elongated, yellowed, morphing into wicked claws before my very eyes. Her eyes, fixed on her transformed hands, were no longer the soft, muted color I'd imagined. They were wide, vacant, and unsettlingly white. The man, Daniel, finally stirred, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Love, what's happened to you?" And then the woman, the victim, unleashed it. Her body convulsed, a wave of raw, burning rage washing over her. The sound that ripped from her throat was not human. It was a primordial shriek, a blaring, guttural roar that seemed to tear through the very fabric of reality. The framed photographs on the wall, already trembling, rattled violently, and one, already cracked, exploded outward, showering the room with splinters of glass. "What the fuck is wrong with me?" she screamed, her voice deepening, becoming monstrous, yet still laced with a horrifying anguish. Her entire skull seemed to contort, a fresh, sickening tearing sound, accompanying the visible ripping of flesh around the base of the horns. What the fuck is wrong with me?" It was a revelation, delivered with the force of a physical blow. The demon hadn't just possessed Daniel, it had created one in her, or awakened it, or perhaps it had simply been transferred. The implications made my blood run cold. Daniel, the supposed host, the one who was supposed to be the monster, recoiled, stumbling backwards, genuine terror etched on his features. He was no longer possessed, he was just a man, witnessing the horrifying transformation of the woman he claimed to love. The woman's new monstrous face turned towards me, her eyes, those vacant white orbs, locking onto mine. A flicker of something ancient and terrible burned in their depths, something that recognized me, perhaps, as another vessel of trauma, another magnet for the darkness that permeated this world. I felt a cold surge of understanding, of shared fate. "Fuck you, you fucking fuck," she yelled, her voice a chorus of pure fury and deep, shattering pain. "Just shut up, please." And then, as suddenly as it had erupted, the rage in her seemed to coil back. The horns, still black and gnarled, twisted inward, seeming to retract, though the fresh wounds continued to ooze. Her claws seemed to shrink. Her eyes flickered with a returning, agonizing humanity, still white, still vacant, but no longer radiating primal fury. She collapsed onto the floor, a heap of human misery. Daniel, cautious, almost hesitant, crept towards her, perching on the edge of the mattress. His voice was soft, almost soothing, a deceptive lullaby that made my stomach churn. "No, love, you aren't a monster. You are strong, but you are damaged." His eyes, however, held a flicker of something unreadable, something calculating beneath the veneer of concern. It looks like you have a demon, too, probably put inside you by one of those guys with their bad intentions. He sighed, pushing her bangs back, a disturbingly intimate gesture. It's fate, love, for us to be together. I will fix you, and I will protect you from the demon inside of you. I'm the only one who understands what it's like to have one, so only I can save you from it, save you from yourself. I stood there, frozen in the doorway, my go bag slung over my shoulder, my hand still gripping the cool metal of my wristwatch, turning the crown aimlessly. The stench of rot still hung heavy in the air. The shattered glass glittered, and the words, Daniel's words, echoed in the apartment, a twisted sermon of control and manipulation. My initial surge of reluctant conscience had propelled me here, had forced me to witness this sickening display. Now, it was replaced by something far more cynical, far more weary. This wasn't just a demonic possession. This was a psychological battlefield, a twisted form of abuse cloaked in supernatural horror. Daniel wasn't just a victim. He was a manipulator, perhaps a true monster, exploiting the very real demonic presence to further his control, to convince her that she was broken and only he could fix her. He had offered her a sick parody of salvation, chaining her to him with invisible binds, far stronger than any physical restraint. And she, the victim, was now just another link in the chain, another monster in the making. The realization settled heavy in my gut. My life, my curse, had led me to witness yet another horror, another facet of the endless darkness that clung to the edges of humanity. The things I'd seen on the road, the phantom hitchhiker, Ethan's depravity, Olivia's skin collection, they were all different notes in the same terrifying symphony. People turning into monsters, or revealing the monsters that had always been lurking beneath the skin. And often, it was the normal ones, the quiet ones, the ones offering love and protection, who were the most insidious. I didn't say a word. There was nothing to say. I'd seen enough. My job here wasn't to intervene, not truly. It was to witness, to observe, to add another layer to the trauma that defined my existence. My fatal flaw, my reluctant conscience had gotten me in, and now my instinct for survival, honed by years of running, was screaming at me to get out. My hand tightened on my watch, the cold metal a small anchor point in the churning chaos. I turned slowly, my boots crunching softly on the glass shards near the door. I didn't look back at them, at the broken woman and the smiling devil in human skin. The air in the hallway felt suddenly lighter, cleaner, though I knew it was an illusion. The stench of rot, the echo of the screams, the image of those black, gnarled horns erupting from a human skull. They were already etched onto the walls of my mind. Another permanent fixture in the Leo Vance Chronicles. Just another ghost to keep me company on the lonely road ahead. I closed the door to apartment 3B, a quiet click that sealed away a fresh hell. My work shift wasn't over, but I knew I'd be gone by dawn. This city, like all the others, had just become too loud, too heavy, too much like home. Character count 9,876.